Hey everyone, tonight we're cracking open one of the strangest files in medical history. Picture this, it's 1898 and the most trusted pharmaceutical company on the planet is selling a brand new cough syrup. It's marketed to mothers, it's marketed for babies, it's stamped with a logo you still see on aspirin today. And the name printed right there on the label, in proud Gothic lettering, Heroin. Yeah, that heroin. Sold over the counter, next to the throat lozenges, with a little drawing of a smiling family on the box. How did the same compound go from being a respected family remedy to the headline of every cautionary tale of the 20th century? That's the ride we're taking tonight. We're going back to a forgotten London lab in 1874, a frantic 11-day sprint inside a German chemistry department, a worldwide marketing blitz that would make modern ad agencies jealous, and the slow, awkward moment when the entire medical world had to quietly admit it had made a catastrophic mistake. Heroes, villains, misplaced notebooks, buyer reps handing out free samples at the grocery store, the whole circus. Before we get into it, do me a favour and hit that like button, smash subscribe so the algorithm actually shows you part 2, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I genuinely love reading those. Alright, let's get into it. To understand how the most notorious drug of the modern age ended up in a cheerful little bottle on a family's kitchen shelf, we have to rewind the clock further than most people expect. Not to 1898, not to the gleaming laboratories of Imperial Germany. We have to go back to a soggy London afternoon in 1874, to a working hospital pharmacy where a tired chemist was trying to invent something that would make his name, and instead accidentally invented something that would haunt the next 150 years. The twist, as you'll see, is that he had absolutely no idea. He simply jotted down a few notes, shrugged, and moved on. That shrug is where our story actually begins. The man in question was Charles Romilly Alder-Wright, a working chemist at St Mary's Hospital Medical School in Paddington. St Mary's at that point was not the glamorous teaching hospital it would later become. It was a cramped, coal-dusted institution squeezed between railway tracks and tenements, perpetually short on funds, and staffed by the sort of earnest British academics who kept their overcoats on indoors because the radiators were, let's say, aspirational. Wright was 30 years old, ambitious, overworked, and mildly obsessed with a problem that had been plaguing 19th century medicine for decades. That problem was morphine. Not morphine itself exactly, but what morphine was doing to patients. By the 1870s, the entire medical profession had essentially fallen head over heels, in love with this miracle painkiller, and unfortunately, so had a concerning number of their patients. Physicians were beginning to notice that their favourite prescription tended to come back through the front door at the end of a long chain, each link uglier than the last. Patients who had been given morphine for a broken arm 6 months ago were now turning up, complaining of mysterious aches that only seemed to respond to, you guessed it, more morphine. Civil War veterans on both sides of the Atlantic had returned home with what was delicately called the soldier's disease, which was just a polite Victorian way of saying they could not function without their daily dose. The medical community was collectively realizing that it had a situation on its hands, and naturally the preferred solution was not to use less of the drug. It was to find a better drug, a cleaner one, a tidier one, ideally one that worked just as well but somehow, magically, skipped the inconvenient part where patients became dependent on it for the rest of their natural lives. This was the Victorian approach to pharmacology in a nutshell. If a treatment has a problem, the solution is never to step back and reconsider. The solution is to chemically modify the treatment until the problem technically has a new name. This attitude would drive the next 30 years of drug development, and it is, incidentally, the same attitude that produced several of the worst pharmaceutical disasters of the 20th century. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Back in Wright's little laboratory, the chemist was fiddling with morphine molecules the way a watchmaker fiddles with tiny gears, trying to attach various chemical side groups to see what would happen. One of the techniques he decided to try was acetylation. In plain English, acetylation is a process where you bolt a little chemical handle called an acetyl group onto a molecule, which tends to change how that molecule behaves in the body. Chemists in the 1870s loved acetylation the way modern tech bros love artificial intelligence. It was the hot technique of the moment, being applied to every compound anyone could get their hands on, and it occasionally produced genuinely useful results. So Wright heated up some morphine with acetic anhydride, cooked the mixture for a few hours, and produced a new substance. Technically, he produced diacetyl morphine, though he did not call it that. He did not call it anything particularly catchy. In his notes, it appears as a modest chemical designation that sounds like a password you would forget instantly. Now, at this point, most chemists would have simply added the new compound to their growing collection of interesting failures and moved on. Wright, however, decided to test it. He was a diligent scientist, and diligent Victorian scientists tested their creations by finding something smaller than themselves to feed it to. In Wright's case, that something was a dog, which he borrowed from, well, wherever Victorian chemists borrowed dogs from. A rabbit also made an appearance, as did at least one unfortunate cat. Wright administered doses of his new compound to these animals and observed what followed, and what followed was deeply unimpressive, at least to him. The animals became extremely sleepy. They developed wide, glassy stares. Their breathing slowed. They seemed uninterested in food, uninterested in their surroundings, uninterested, frankly, in being dogs or cats or rabbits at all. One of them, according to Wright's own notes, experienced such a violent drop in body temperature and muscle coordination that it had to be revived with some urgency. Wright, whose main interest was finding a clean replacement for morphine, looked at these results and came to a very particular conclusion. This compound, he decided, was too strong, too sedating, too weird. It was not a replacement for morphine. If anything, it was morphine's unstable younger cousin who shows up to family dinners and causes a scene. He wrote up his findings in a paper published in 1874 in the Journal of the Chemical Society, titled with the thrilling name On the Action of Organic Acids and Their Anhydrides on the Natural Alkaloids. This is, unsurprisingly, not a title that sets the scientific world on fire. The paper was read by a small number of specialists, filed away in the relevant journal archives, and then promptly, thoroughly, almost poetically forgotten. This is the part of the story that always gets me. For the next 23 years, the formula for what the world would eventually know as heroin simply sat there. It lived in a stack of bound journals in a few specialized libraries, gathering the distinctive yellow patina that Victorian paper gathers when no one opens it. It was not secret. It was not hidden. Any chemist who knew how to use a library card could have walked in, found the article, and replicated Wright's work in an afternoon. But chemistry in the late 1800s was a sprawling, chaotic frontier, with thousands of new compounds being synthesized every year, and the vast majority of them were going nowhere. The diacetyl morphine molecule was just one of hundreds of failed morphine modifications that the profession had collectively shrugged at. Wright himself moved on to other research, eventually dying in 1894 without ever realizing what he had briefly held in his hands. He went to his grave genuinely believing that his main legacy was his work on alloys and on the chemistry of photography, which is a bit like Christopher Columbus dying convinced that his real achievement was his work on navigation charts. The universe has a sense of humour, and the joke is usually on the person who thought they had figured it out. There is something almost peaceful about imagining the compound during those lost years. While it waited, the world churned on. Queen Victoria remained firmly on the throne. The first electric lights began replacing gas lamps in certain fashionable districts. The germ theory of disease crawled, centimetre by centimetre, towards scientific consensus. Horse-drawn carriages still clattered over cobblestones, but somewhere in Germany, a man named Carl Benz was fiddling with something he called a horseless carriage. Napoleon III fell. Otto von Bismarck rose. The Eiffel Tower went up. The first skyscrapers cracked the Chicago skyline. 2 generations of chemistry students came and went, earning their doctorates, starting their careers, and never once pausing on page 320 of the 1874 Journal of the Chemical Society. The formula waited with the patience of something that had nowhere particular to be. In retrospect, you could almost read the whole thing as a cautionary tale about what happens when you treat dangerous discoveries as boring ones. Though of course no one at the time was reading it as anything at all. It was simply one more line in a very thick book. The reason this dormant period matters so much is that it demonstrates a truth about scientific progress that gets left out of the inspirational posters. Discoveries do not always arrive when they are first made. They arrive when somebody, somewhere, finally finds a use for them. A hammer in an empty workshop is just a piece of metal with a handle. The hammer only becomes a hammer when somebody picks it up with a nail in mind. Diacetylmorphine, sitting quietly in its journal citation for 2 full decades, was a hammer waiting for the right nail. It would take a rapidly industrializing Europe, a public health crisis, a brilliant marketing department, and a particular confluence of personalities to finally pick that hammer up. But when those pieces did come together, they came together with a speed and force that nobody could have predicted. Least of all the modest chemist in Paddington, who had briefly held the whole thing in his hands, and then, with perfect Victorian understatement, decided it was not worth the bother. And with that, we move from a forgotten English laboratory to the polished, humming corridors of a German pharmaceutical giant, where in the summer of 1897, a young chemist was about to accidentally change the 20th century twice in the space of about 11 days. If you thought one accidental drug invention was a lot for a single origin story, strap in. We're about to meet a man who basically invented aspirin on a Tuesday and heroin on the following Monday, and still somehow found time for lunch. The setting now shifts to the town of Barmen, in the industrial heart of Germany's Rhineland, a place that today sits inside the modern city of Wuppertal, but in 1897 was its own bustling factory town of red brick chimneys, narrow canals, and the constant low rumble of textile mills. Nestled among these factories was a growing chemical company called Farbenfabriken Wormels, Friedrich Bayer and Company, which had started life in the 1860s making synthetic dyes for the booming European fabric trade. This is an important detail. Bayer was not originally a medicine company, it was a colour company. The reason so many early pharmaceutical giants were born out of dye manufacturers is because the same organic chemistry techniques used to produce vivid purples and reds and yellows for fabric happened to be excellent for producing novel drug molecules. It turns out that making a shirt really blue and making a pill really effective involve a surprising amount of overlapping laboratory equipment. By the 1890s, Bayer's leadership had noticed that pharmaceuticals offered far higher profit margins than textile dyes, and they had quietly begun to pivot. A research division had been established, complete with a proper laboratory, a library of scientific journals, and most crucially, a director of pharmaceutical research. That director was a formidable Württemberg-born chemist named Heinrich Drieser. Drieser is a fascinating figure, and not entirely in a flattering way. He was in his late 30s at this point, a man of precise habits, elaborate moustaches, and the kind of self-confidence that only arrives when you have been correct about something important early in your career. He had done distinguished work on the stimulant effects of certain alkaloids, and he had earned a reputation as a rigorous testing scientist, which meant his approval was considered the final word on whether a new Bayer compound was ready for the public. He also had a personal arrangement with his employers that would turn out to be enormously consequential. Drieser had negotiated a royalty deal on any drug that came out of his department, meaning he personally received a cut of the profits from anything Bayer manufactured under his supervision. This was, let us say, a system with certain motivational features built into it. Drieser was not going to miss a promising compound, and he was definitely not going to approve an unpromising one. He had every reason, financial and professional, to push anything that looked like a winner straight through to market as quickly as possible. Keep this in mind because it will come up. Working beneath Drieser were two junior chemists who would both, in their own ways, leave permanent fingerprints on the 20th century. The first was a thoughtful Alsatian chemist named Arthur Eichengrün, whose contributions would later be systematically erased from Bayer's corporate history, for reasons that have nothing to do with chemistry and everything to do with the politics of the 1930s. The second was a young man from Ludwigsburg named Felix Hoffmann. Hoffmann was 28 years old in the summer of 1897, a recent doctorate relatively new to the company, and by all accounts an agreeable, competent, unassuming presence in the laboratory. He was not a flashy scientist. He did not give speeches. He showed up, did his work carefully, and went home to a quiet bachelor apartment where, according to legend, he sometimes played piano in the evenings. The legend is also where a great deal of the following story gets complicated, because Bayer itself would spend the next century promoting a very particular, very marketable origin tale involving Hoffmann and his suffering father. That tale goes like this. Hoffmann's father was an older gentleman who suffered terribly from rheumatism, for which the standard treatment at the time was salicylic acid, a harsh compound extracted from willow bark that helpfully reduced inflammation, while unhelpfully destroying the lining of the patient's stomach. Hoffmann, the story goes, was so moved by his father's suffering that he set out to chemically modify salicylic acid into something gentler. On the 10th of August, 1897, he succeeded, producing a compound called acetyl salicylic acid, which Bayer would market under the now immortal name aspirin. It is a beautiful story. It has a sick parent, a loving son, a scientific breakthrough, and a happy ending. It has also been extensively questioned by historians, several of whom have presented compelling evidence that the real breakthrough behind aspirin came from Eichengrün, and that Hoffmann's primary role was the laboratory execution. The credit reshuffling appears to have happened decades later, during a period of German history when having an Alsatian Jewish chemist as the inventor of the country's most famous drug became, for the authorities of the time, politically inconvenient. Bayer's official version was rewritten accordingly, and the elegant father and son narrative stuck. We will not untangle all of that here, because frankly the full story could be its own video, but it is worth knowing that the tidy version you may have heard is not the whole picture. Chemistry is rarely a single-person story, no matter how neatly the marketing department presents it. What is not in doubt is the extraordinary timeline of what happened next. 11 days after the aspirin synthesis, on or around the 21st of August, 1897, the same laboratory produced another compound. Working from the same acetylation techniques that had just been applied to salicylic acid, the team turned the procedure on a different starting material. They took morphine, the exact same morphine that had been worrying doctors for decades, and they ran it through essentially the same chemical process. What came out the other side was a fluffy white crystalline powder. In the notebook entries that survive, it is recorded as a successful synthesis of diacetyl morphine, the compound that Charles Alder Wright had briefly held in his Paddington laboratory 23 years earlier. The compound that had made a dog uncomfortable and then been filed away had just been reinvented, unknowingly, by chemists who had never heard of Wright's paper. The universe, having waited patiently for more than 2 decades, apparently decided that its moment had come. Now, in fairness to the Bayer team, they very quickly realized they had stumbled onto something that seemed, at least on initial testing, genuinely impressive. Drieser, still wearing his pharmacological director hat, took samples of the new compound and began the standard evaluation process. He tested it on animals, on laboratory assistants, on factory workers, and eventually, following a charming 19th century tradition, on himself. The reports were glowing. Coughs stopped, pain retreated, anxieties evaporated, fatigue lifted. Test subjects described an astonishing sense of confidence and well-being, a surge of energy paired with a relaxed, in-control feeling. One of the most frequently quoted phrases from these early trials is that subjects said they felt heroic, like they could take on the world. Drieser, delighted, saw the commercial possibilities immediately. The German word for heroic, heroisch, was plucked from those trial reports by the marketing department. It was memorable, it was proud, it was also catchy enough to print on a bottle, and so, with a small linguistic trim, the compound received its commercial name, Heroin. It is worth pausing here to appreciate just how enthusiastically Bayer fumbled the testing phase, because this is where the modern reader starts to feel the urge to shout warnings into the past. The initial trials were short, small, and almost entirely focused on the drug's immediate pleasant effects. There was essentially no long-term follow-up. The animal experiments did not extend to repeated dosing over weeks or months, which is precisely the scenario in which dependence would have revealed itself. The human subjects were tested for acute effects, not chronic ones. Worst of all, Drieser leaned heavily on a theory that had been floating around German pharmacology circles for a few years, which held that the body could not become dependent on a drug if the drug did not produce euphoria through smoking. Heroin was taken orally, usually as a syrup. Therefore, the thinking went, it could not be addictive. This theory was, to put it generously, wrong. It was wrong in the specific about this drug, and it was wrong in the general, about how dependence works. But it was the fashionable scientific opinion of the moment, and Drieser seized on it like a man grabbing a life preserver. Because it let him report to his superiors that Bayer's new miracle drug had all of morphine's benefits and none of its risks. If there was a moment in this entire timeline when the wheels of history could have turned a different direction, this was it. A more cautious director might have demanded a year or 2 of extended testing. A less financially motivated evaluator might have poked at the addiction question a little harder. A more thorough review of the scientific literature might have even turned up that modest 1874 paper by a dead English chemist describing how this exact compound made laboratory animals behave in distinctly concerning ways. Any one of these interventions might have slowed the release, or at least forced a more careful labelling, or at minimum prevented the product from being marketed as a cough syrup suitable for children. None of those interventions happened. The theory was flattering. The trial results were glowing. The compound was patentable, and the royalties naturally were calling. There is a detail worth flagging here that we will return to later. Dreiser himself, in the course of his self-experimentation, appears to have become a regular user of the very drug he was about to approve. He would not be the last person in this story to experience that particular irony. Within a few months of the synthesis, Bayer had moved with remarkable speed to commercialize its new discovery. Production was scaled up at the Elberfeld works, packaging was designed, pricing was set, and marketing materials were prepared for what the company clearly understood was going to be a major release. The plan was to launch heroin internationally, with sample shipments sent to physicians in dozens of countries, advertisements placed in the most respected medical journals, and the product positioned not as a replacement for morphine but as a wholesale improvement over it, suitable for the general family market. In late 1898, heroin officially went on sale. You could walk into a pharmacy in Berlin, Vienna, Paris, London, Boston, New York, Sydney, Cape Town, Buenos Aires, or Tokyo, and purchase a bottle over the counter, no prescription required in most jurisdictions, stamped with the now famous Bayer cross logo, and labelled with confidence as a remedy for coughs, bronchitis, tuberculosis, whooping cough, and general respiratory complaints. Other labels, printed for slightly different markets, added chest colds, pneumonia, asthma, and the vague but apparently lucrative category of nervous complaints. A companion product, aspirin, launched alongside it, aimed at pain and fever. The two drugs were even advertised together on some Bayer brochures, presented as a matched pair of modern miracles, one for what hurt and one for what coughed. Of those two twin molecules born in the same laboratory within 2 weeks of each other, we know how the story ended. One became arguably the most successful over-the-counter medication in human history, still sitting in medicine cabinets worldwide more than a century later, still saving lives, still quietly humming along as a bedrock of modern pharmacy. The other became a synonym for ruin. The fascinating and slightly uncomfortable fact is that at their moment of birth, neither Hoffmann nor Dreiser nor anyone at Bayer could have told you which would be which. From the inside of that Elberfeld laboratory in August 1897, aspirin and heroin looked like siblings of roughly equal promise. Aspirin was actually considered the less exciting of the two initially, because its effect on pain and fever was modest and reliable, while heroin's effect on patients was dramatic and immediate and theatrical. If you had asked the Bayer sales team in 1898 which product was going to make the company famous, every single one of them would have pointed at heroin. Aspirin was the quiet achiever. Heroin was the star. What nobody in that room understood, and what it would take another 15 years of mounting evidence to finally force everyone to admit, was that the dramatic, immediate theatrical effect was precisely the problem. The feature was, in fact, the bug. But in 1898, standing at the threshold of a new century with glowing trial reports, glowing journal reviews, and a pipeline of distribution running across 6 continents, Bayer had no reason to worry. They had a heroic new product, a beautiful new brand, and the complete uncritical trust of the medical profession. The stage was set, the curtain was about to rise, and the audience, which is to say the entire industrialized world, was about to line up for what it had been promised was a modern miracle. The line, as we'll see, turned out to be a lot longer and a lot sadder than anyone imagined. The product was ready. The bottles were on the shipping pallets. The medical journals had already received their polite introductory letters. Bayer's new compound was prepared for a global launch, and the only remaining question was whether the market would actually want it. The answer, as it turned out, was a thunderous yes. And to understand why, we need to step out of the laboratory and take a good long look at the world that heroin was about to walk into. Because the genius of heroin's commercial success, if we can use a word like genius in this context, was not really about the chemistry at all. It was about timing. Bayer released a cough medicine during what might be, without much competition, the coughiest moment in human history. Picture the average European or North American city in the final years of the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution had been busy for several decades now, and the results were, let us say, visible. Enormous brick factories had sprouted up along riverbanks and rail lines. belching thick black smoke into the sky 24 hours a day. The smoke was not a metaphor. It was a physical thing, a heavy oily substance that settled onto windows, onto laundry lines, onto the shoulders of your coat when you walked to work in the morning. London during this era was famous for what locals politely called pea soupers, which was a soft name for a genuinely lethal fog formed when coal smoke mixed with the river damp and parked itself at ground level for days at a time. The fog was so thick that theatres sometimes had to cancel performances because the audience sitting in the stalls could no longer see the stage. Trains collided on suburban lines because signalmen could not see their own signals. Pedestrians walked straight into canals. The colour of the sky in many working-class neighbourhoods was not blue or grey or even the honest dark of night, but a strange yellowish brown that tinted every surface beneath it. And naturally everyone was breathing it. All day. Every day. For generations. If you lived in one of these cities, you coughed. You coughed when you woke up because your lungs had been quietly settling overnight. You coughed when you went to work because your walk took you past at least 3 chimneys and 1 gasworks. You coughed during your shift because the shift itself almost certainly involved breathing something unpleasant, whether it was coal dust in a mine, cotton fibres in a textile mill, chemical fumes in a tannery, or the simple proximity of hundreds of co-workers in a poorly ventilated room, most of whom were also coughing. You coughed at lunch because lunch tended to happen somewhere the air was about as bad as it was outside. You coughed on the way home. You coughed at dinner. You coughed in bed. Your children coughed. Your parents coughed if they were still alive, which statistically was not a foregone conclusion in those years. Even your grandparents coughed, although they did so less often, because grandparents in 1898 were a surprisingly rare breed. Life expectancy at birth in many industrial cities hovered somewhere in the mid-40s, and coughing was often the soundtrack playing quietly beneath every other event in a person's life. It is genuinely difficult for a modern audience to grasp how ambient this was. We live in a world where a persistent cough is treated as a medical event. You take a day off work, you phone your doctor, you get tested for various possibilities, you, very possibly, take it upon yourself to be concerned. In 1898, a persistent cough was just background noise, no more remarkable than traffic. Everyone had one. Stopping to mention yours would be like stopping in the middle of a city street to note that there were, unusually, some birds visible in the sky. It was the baseline. The medical profession was, of course, trying to do something about this, and the tools available to them were, let us say, a mixed bag. The traditional remedy for a cough in the late 1800s was a category of syrups known broadly as cough mixtures, and these mixtures were a pharmacological adventure in their own right. The most common active ingredients were, in ascending order of alarm, alcohol, laudanum, which is opium dissolved in alcohol, morphine, which is opium's purified cousin, camphor, which is a tree extract with its own issues, chloroform, which is a solvent that was also being used at the time as an anaesthetic, and occasionally for the adventurous pharmacist, a splash of cocaine to give the whole concoction a little pep. A housewife buying cough syrup at her local chemist in 1895 was not necessarily aware of any of this. The bottle simply said cough syrup, and it tasted sweet because it was usually suspended in sugary glycerin, and it usually worked, in the sense that after taking it, one did tend to stop coughing, lie down, and feel quite pleasant for a few hours. Whether the cough had actually been treated or merely politely asked to step aside was, philosophically speaking, not a question most consumers were asking. Against this background, we also have to talk about the diseases. The 19th century was the age of industrial progress, electricity, and the telegraph. But it was also, rather spectacularly, the age of infectious disease. Tuberculosis in particular was everywhere. It was so common and so consistently fatal and so embedded in the cultural imagination that it had its own nicknames in every major European language. In English it was called consumption, because it appeared to consume the person from within. In French it was la maladie de poitrine. In Italian, il mal sottile, the subtle illness. It killed an estimated 1 in 7 people across Europe and North America during much of the century, and in some urban working-class neighbourhoods that figure rose to 1 in 4. It was the single leading cause of death in cities like London, New York, Paris, and Berlin. Everyone knew someone who had died of it. Many people knew several. Literature of the period is so saturated with coughing heroines and wasting heroes that it almost reads today like a parody, but it was not a literary device. It was simply a description of what daily life looked like. Writers did not have to invent sick characters, because sick characters were sitting at every other dinner table, and tuberculosis was not alone. Influenza epidemics swept through cities on a regular schedule, taking out particularly the very young and the very old. Pneumonia was a seasonal killer. Whooping cough, which modern readers might associate with a minor childhood inconvenience, was in 1898 a genuine threat to infants, capable of producing coughing fits so severe that babies could not draw breath between them, and not uncommonly could not draw breath at all. Pertussis, the technical name for whooping cough, was killing somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 children a year in the United States alone during this period, and similar figures applied across Europe. The bronchitis that haunted factory workers was often the early warning sign of worse things to come. Asthma, without modern inhalers, was managed through a combination of wishful thinking and herbal cigarettes, which is exactly what it sounds like. And yes, that was a real medical product sold in tins at respectable pharmacies, recommended by respectable doctors. Against this storm front of respiratory misery, physicians stood armed with their cough syrups and their reassuring bedside manner, and not a great deal else. Now stir in one more ingredient, because the cultural backdrop is crucial to what happened next. The late 19th century was the absolute high watermark of public trust in science. You have to understand what the preceding several decades had looked like from the perspective of an ordinary educated person. Just within living memory, science had given the world the railway, which had shrunk continents from weeks to hours. It had given the world the telegraph, which meant a message from New York could reach London in minutes rather than weeks. It had given the world electric lighting, photography, the phonograph, the internal combustion engine, anesthesia, antiseptic surgery, and the germ theory of disease, which had finally explained why cleaning the surgical instruments between patients was not merely a polite suggestion. Each of these had seemed impossible at first, and each had then become routine, usually within a single lifetime. By the 1890s, the default assumption of the educated public was that science could solve anything given enough time, and that anything labelled scientific was therefore to be trusted. Newspapers breathlessly reported every new discovery. Popular magazines carried illustrated features on the latest laboratories and the men running them. Children's books featured dashing young chemists as heroes. A brand new product, wrapped in the language of modern pharmaceutical research, stamped with the logo of a respected European laboratory, accompanied by testimonials from actual doctors and journal reviews from actual scientists, could count on the public's absolute and almost unconditional confidence. It had earned that confidence. It was just about to spend it very unwisely. Into this world, Bayer dropped its new product. The timing, to repeat, was perfect to the point of eeriness. You had a population that coughed constantly, that watched their children die of respiratory illnesses with appalling regularity, that was already accustomed to taking morphine-based syrups as a matter of routine, and that believed, with the unshakable faith of a civilization that had just invented electric light, that modern science was going to sort everything out eventually. And now science had in fact sent a solution. A cough medicine, not a desperate old opium concoction, but a bright new synthesized compound from a proper German laboratory, labelled as a safe and non-habit, forming improvement on everything that had come before. It stopped coughs within minutes. It soothed the patient. It produced a feeling of general well-being, which after a lifetime of grinding industrial exhaustion was not a side effect so much as a headline feature. The demand was, within months, overwhelming. Bayer's factory at Elberfeld ran double shifts. Orders poured in from hospitals, from private physicians, from pharmacies, from colonial medical services, from navies, from armies, from charitable societies distributing supplies to the urban poor. Competitors began scrambling to license the compound, or to synthesize it themselves, which many of them successfully did within a year, since the underlying chemistry was, as we have established, not exactly classified. By 1900, heroin was being manufactured and distributed by at least a dozen pharmaceutical companies on 3 continents, all of them using Bayer's marketing playbook, all of them riding the same wave of public enthusiasm. There is a particular detail from these early years that I find genuinely striking, which is how specifically the drug was marketed as suitable for children. Not as a begrudging concession, not as an off-label use, but as a primary selling point. The advertising, which we will look at in more detail shortly, repeatedly emphasized that heroin was gentle enough for infants, that it soothed the nighttime coughs of sick babies, that it allowed exhausted children to finally sleep. Pharmacists routinely recommended it for whooping cough, for croup, for the vague cluster of childhood respiratory troubles that terrified every parent. It was sold in tiny dropper bottles with cheerful labels, formulated in sweetened syrup so that even reluctant children would accept it, and positioned in pharmacy windows alongside other household staples. Modern readers often ask how this was possible, and the honest answer is that in the context of 1899, it did not seem strange at all. Morphine had been given to children for decades. Laudanum had been given to children for more than a century. The Bayer product was simply the next, improved entry in a very old tradition of giving powerful sedatives to sick kids in the hope that they would feel better. If anything, heroin seemed safer, because it came from a modern factory with a clean laboratory reputation, unlike the rough and variable opium tinctures of the previous generation. This brings us, in a natural and somewhat uncomfortable way, to the scene we need to visit next, which is the ordinary domestic interior of a respectable middle-class household around the year 1903, 5 full years into the heroin era, at the moment when the drug had finished its transition from laboratory curiosity to household fixture. The action, if we can call it that, takes place in a parlour in a comfortable suburb of any major city you care to name. Let us set ours in Vienna, although it could equally well be in Brooklyn or in Manchester or in Melbourne. The house belongs to a woman we will call Madame E., a respectable physician's wife in her early 30s, mother of 2 small children, active in her local charitable society, reader of improving literature, wearer of modest but fashionable dresses, and owner of a small collection of silver teaspoons that she polishes every Saturday morning. On her parlour mantelpiece, between a photograph of her late grandmother and a china figurine of a shepherdess, sits a small amber glass bottle. The label on the bottle is printed in clean Gothic lettering. It features a discreet Bayer cross. It identifies the contents as heroin hydrochloride, 0.5% solution in glycerin. Below that, in smaller type, the label states that the product is gentle and non-habit forming, suitable for use by persons of all ages including infants, and recommended by physicians for the relief of coughs, bronchial irritation, menstrual discomfort, nervous exhaustion, insomnia, and general debility. There is a small glass dropper tucked into a leather case beside the bottle. The whole arrangement looks about as alarming as a bottle of vanilla extract. Madame E's morning routine includes, among other things, 3 small administrations of heroin. The first goes to the younger child, aged 15 months, who has developed a persistent cough following a mild cold. 2 drops on the tongue, delivered via the glass dropper, in accordance with the dosage card that came with the bottle. The baby, who had been fretful and unable to sleep, immediately settles into a deep, peaceful nap that lasts for about 4 hours. This is enormously convenient for Madame E., whose morning would otherwise involve rocking a fretful infant while also trying to oversee the cook. The second administration goes to Madame E. herself, 3 drops in a small glass of water, taken to ease what she refers to in her diary as her monthly indisposition. The effect is pleasant, a soft easing of cramping in her abdomen combined with a mild lightness in her mood. Her diary for this week mentions that she felt unusually productive and cheerful, and managed to write 3 letters to her sisters, reorganize the linen cupboard, and compose a charming note to her husband at his office. The third administration is reserved for the evening, when her older child, aged 4, is put to bed. A single drop to help the little one settle. The household, as a result, is remarkably quiet after 8 in the evening. Madame E's husband, returning from his practice, remarks pleasantly on how well everyone has been sleeping. None of this, at the time, was considered unusual. If you had suggested to Madame E that she was participating in a slow-motion public health catastrophe, she would have laughed politely and offered you tea. She was not a reckless woman. She was not a negligent mother. She was, in every sense the word carried in 1903, a responsible and well-informed homemaker, using a modern medical product in accordance with the instructions, under the implicit approval of her physician husband, with the explicit endorsement of the manufacturer, the pharmacist, and the medical journals she occasionally flipped through in his study. She was exactly the kind of customer Bayer had designed the product for, and the product was working exactly as Bayer had advertised. Her children coughed less, they slept better. Her own monthly difficulties were more manageable, she felt better, her household ran more smoothly. The drug was, in the short term and by every visible metric doing precisely what it had been sold to do. The problem, of course, is that the metrics that mattered were not visible in the short term and would not become visible for a long while yet. The conversations Madame E had with other women in her social circle during this period would, to a modern ear, be genuinely surreal. Heroin was a perfectly ordinary topic of domestic conversation. Among women in her social circle, heroin was an ordinary topic of domestic conversation, discussed in the same tone a modern woman might use about a favourite moisturiser. A casual recommendation between friends, without a flicker of alarm. The doctors in this period were, if anything, more enthusiastic than their patients. A general practitioner in any European or American city in 1903 was very likely to have heroin in his medical bag, alongside morphine, digitalis, quinine, and a small assortment of basic surgical tools. He would prescribe it freely for children and adults for acute complaints and chronic ones, with a confidence rooted in the published medical literature. Multiple respected medical journals had, in the years since the drug's launch, published enthusiastic reviews of its safety and efficacy. The leading German, French, British, and American medical publications all carried favourable articles during the late 1890s and early 1900s, many of them written by physicians who had personally tested the compound on their patients, and, in several cases, on themselves. The Lancet, one of the most respected medical journals in the world, carried notices describing heroin as a remarkable advance. The Boston Medical and Surgical Journal ran a piece praising its usefulness in treating the respiratory complications of tuberculosis. The Journal of the American Medical Association, which later in the 20th century would play a significant role in warning the public about the drug, was at this moment publishing articles that carefully described its clinical uses and, in one memorable 1902 piece, concluded that heroin was an ideal substitute for codeine in pediatric practice. Pediatric practice, meaning children. These were not fringe publications. These were the central organs of the medical establishment, written by the most respected practitioners of the era, and they were, collectively, endorsing a product that was quietly creating the first generation of an international public health crisis. It is worth pausing to acknowledge what a dark comedy this was. The drug had been invented in part to solve the problem of morphine dependence. It had been marketed as a cure for morphine dependence, among other things, and in the early years there was actually a minor boom in sanatoriums that specialised in weaning patients off morphine by switching them to heroin. The underlying logic here is so perfectly circular that it deserves a slow, admiring pause. Patients who had become dependent on morphine were being treated by substituting a chemically similar but more potent compound, which naturally produced dependence of its own, generally within a matter of weeks. The sanatorium would then discharge the patient as cured of morphine, which was technically true, in the sense that they no longer needed morphine. They now needed heroin instead. The physicians involved appear to have genuinely believed they were helping. Some of them, more cynical or more attentive readers of their own clinical records, began to notice by around 1902 or 1903 that their supposedly cured former morphine patients were turning up at their offices with new problems. But the connection between the treatment and the new problems was slow to penetrate. The prevailing theory, remember, was that heroin could not cause dependence, because theory is a powerful thing, and the theory was making everyone a great deal of money. By 1905, the pattern was starting to become visible to anyone who was paying close attention, which was not, unfortunately, a large number of people. The early warning signs were appearing in the medical case notes of careful physicians, in the household accounts of families who found themselves ordering larger and larger bottles of the Bayer product, in the quiet, coded conversations between pharmacists who had begun to recognise certain repeat customers, but the broader culture was not yet ready to name what was happening. The drug had become domestic, which in some ways made it harder to see. It lived in medicine cabinets, in kitchen cupboards, in the little chests beside women's beds. It was associated with childhood coughs and afternoon headaches, and the gentle winding down of a busy day. It was wrapped up, culturally, in the same warm wrappings as tea and cough drops and liniment. To notice that there was a problem, you would have had to look at the whole household, over the span of years, and track the slow, invisible way certain members of the family had come to need their drops. Nobody was looking that carefully yet. The drops were, after all, medicine. The medicine was from Bayer. The bottle said it was safe, and the bottle had been saying it was safe for 5 years now, without any particular event to contradict the claim. This is the period that historians sometimes call the silent wave. It is the early invisible phase of a mass dependence, the years when the drug has become embedded in daily life, but the consequences have not yet risen to the level of public scandal. Estimates of exactly how many people in the industrialized world were using heroin routinely during the years between 1901 and 1910 are necessarily rough, because nobody was keeping formal records of something that nobody considered to be a problem yet. But the best reconstructions by later historians, drawing on pharmacy sales figures, Bayer's own production data, import records, and the clinical notes of the small number of early warning voices within the medical profession, suggest that several million regular users existed across Europe, North America, and the various colonial territories where the drug was distributed by Western-trained physicians. Many of these users were, like Madame E., entirely respectable citizens who would have been genuinely offended by the suggestion that they were drug users, and who did not themselves understand that they had developed a dependence. They simply knew that they felt better when they took their drops and worse when they did not. They treated this, as any reasonable person would, as evidence that they needed their drops. The thought that they needed their drops because they had been taking their drops did not yet have a vocabulary, a framework, a name that anyone was using in polite conversation. There is something almost tender about this period, which is an odd thing to say about a mass pharmaceutical disaster, but there it is. These were people doing their best with the information they had. The information happened to be catastrophically wrong, but they had no way of knowing that. They trusted their doctors, who trusted their journals, who trusted the manufacturer, who trusted its research director, who, as we saw earlier, had a financial stake in the trust being maintained. The whole structure was a quietly humming engine of misplaced confidence, and it was going to keep humming for about another decade before the first serious cracks appeared. When the cracks did appear, they would not appear in the laboratories or the journals, although the scientific reckoning was coming too. They would appear first in the ordinary homes of the ordinary families, when a sister or a son or a mother failed to receive their morning dose, and something quietly, disturbingly, undeniably changed in the way they behaved. The label on the bottle was about to meet reality, and reality, as it usually does, was going to win. If the silent wave of the early 1900s was the quiet part of the story, the thing happening above it in full daylight was anything but quiet. While dependence was spreading invisibly through ordinary households, Bayer was running one of the most sophisticated, aggressive, and genuinely brilliant advertising campaigns the world had yet seen. It is difficult to overstate how far ahead of its time this campaign was. The phrase modern marketing did not really exist as a professional discipline in 1900. The word brand was still used mostly to describe what you did to cattle with a hot iron. The concept of building an emotional relationship between a consumer and a product, of selling not the product itself but the lifestyle that the product implied, of creating a visual shorthand that could operate across languages and cultures, was in its absolute infancy. Bayer did not wait for these ideas to be invented and written up in textbooks. Bayer invented them in real time, on the job, for the purpose of selling a cough syrup. And heroin, along with its more fortunate sibling aspirin, was the laboratory in which the whole modern advertising playbook was being drafted, tested, and refined. The centerpiece of the entire operation was the Bayer cross. This is the logo that you can still see today on aspirin bottles in pharmacies all over the world, and it has almost exactly the same design it had in 1899, which is a genuinely remarkable feat of graphic longevity. The cross is a simple affair, geometrically speaking. The word Bayer is written horizontally and then written again vertically, with the two versions sharing the letter Y at the center, all enclosed in a perfectly round ring. It looks almost aggressively clean. It is the kind of logo that seems to have always existed, the way a particular font or a particular pattern of tile can seem to have always existed, even though, of course, someone sat down and designed it. The person in question was one of the company's in-house designers, and the cross was rolled out around 1900, just as heroin was going international. What made the cross work was a combination of factors that marketing professionals would later spend decades trying to study and replicate. It was visually balanced, which meant it looked correct from any angle, at any size, printed in any single color, embossed on any surface. It was memorable, which meant that once you had seen it, you could sketch it from memory even if you had no particular reason to. It was extensible, which meant it could be stamped on a bottle, printed on a poster, cast into a weather vane, embroidered onto a lab coat, sewn onto the side of a delivery van, or quietly placed in the upper right corner of a medical journal advertisement, and it would look correct in every single one of those contexts. And it was credible, which is the word marketers use to describe the quality of making a potential customer feel that the organization behind the symbol knows what it is doing. The Bayer cross radiated competence. It was a logo that looked like it had been focus grouped by a Prussian general and approved by the Ministry of Serious Things. The cross went everywhere. It appeared on the packaging of every Bayer product, naturally, but it also appeared on thousands of promotional items that were distributed for free to pharmacies, clinics, hospitals, and private physicians. Glass display cases designed to sit on a pharmacy counter and hold the full range of Bayer products at the correct angle for customer inspection were shipped to druggists free of charge, with the cross discreetly etched into the glass at eye level. Metal signs, enamelled in the company's signature deep green and bright white, were produced by the tens of thousands and offered gratis to any pharmacy that agreed to mount one outside its front door. Within a few years, in any major European or American city, you could not walk more than 2 blocks without passing at least one of these signs swinging quietly on its bracket above a pharmacy entrance. The signs became so ubiquitous that in some neighbourhoods people began using them as navigational landmarks, which is precisely the kind of cultural embedding that modern brand consultants charge 6-figure fees to try to produce on purpose. Prescription pads, printed at Bayer's expense and distributed in enormous quantities to sympathetic physicians, carried the cross in their upper corner. Bayer also manufactured and gave away a range of useful medical objects, all discreetly branded. Pill counters, which are the little flat trays that pharmacists use to push individual pills into groups of 5 for bottling, came with the cross etched into the handle. Prescription ledgers, thermometers, weighing scales, lab beakers, and even the small porcelain mortars and pestles that every pharmacist used multiple times a day to grind powders were available in Bayer-branded versions, supplied free or at nominal cost. In essence, the company was quietly paying the entire pharmaceutical infrastructure of the Western world to turn itself into a 3-dimensional advertisement. A customer walking into a pharmacy in 1903 would see the Bayer cross on the sign outside, the window display, the interior counter case. The prescription pad in the pharmacist's hand, the pill counter he used to prepare the order, the ledger in which he recorded it, and the bottle in which the product was dispensed. That customer would then walk home past 3 more pharmacies, each with its own Bayer sign, and arrive at a house that likely already contained at least one Bayer product in the medicine cabinet. The word saturation in marketing means precisely this. The advertising in print media followed a similarly disciplined approach. Bayer did not simply buy advertisements. Bayer commissioned a rolling program of carefully designed campaigns, each with its own target audience, its own tone, its own visual identity, and its own measurable objective. This level of sophistication in advertising was, in 1900, genuinely novel. Most pharmaceutical advertising of the era was frankly primitive. A typical advertisement for a patent medicine in an American or European magazine of the 1890s would consist of a rectangle of dense text, usually featuring a shouting headline, a long list of ailments that the product allegedly cured, several quotes from satisfied customers identified only by their initials and the city they lived in, and perhaps a small illustration of the product bottle. The aesthetic, if we can use that word generously, was loud and cluttered. Bayer's advertising was the opposite. It was spacious. It featured generous white margins. It used restrained, carefully chosen typography. It included a single, tasteful illustration, often of a calm and well-dressed figure engaged in some pleasant activity. The copy was short. The tone was dignified. The entire presentation whispered, rather than shouted, that the reader was being addressed as an intelligent adult who could be trusted to recognize quality without having it screamed in their face. The campaigns were also carefully targeted. Advertisements for heroin as a cough medicine for children ran primarily in magazines aimed at middle-class homemakers, featuring tasteful illustrations of mothers tucking healthy-looking children into bed, with copy emphasizing gentleness and safety. Advertisements aimed at physicians ran in medical journals, used a more clinical tone, cited laboratory research, and focused on efficacy and dosing. Advertisements aimed at men, which did exist in surprising numbers, appeared in general interest magazines and featured testimonials framed around recovery from the exhausting demands of modern professional life. One particularly memorable campaign featured illustrations of well-groomed gentlemen in tweed suits, standing on golf courses with text explaining how a course of Bayer's cough remedy had not only cleared up the writer's persistent winter bronchitis, but had also, as a delightful side benefit, allowed him to return to his favourite sporting pursuits with fresh energy and an improved short game. The testimonials were real, or at least were presented as real. They were collected by Bayer's marketing department through a systematic program of soliciting letters from satisfied users, which were then edited, polished, and published with the writer's consent and, in many cases, with a small gift sent in return. The letters were not fabricated in the crude sense, but they were curated with the sort of care that a museum curator applies to an exhibition. The voices of dissatisfied customers, needless to say, were not represented. One of the most effective elements of the Bayer campaign was its strategic use of what modern marketers would call authority positioning. Every advertisement, whether aimed at homemakers or physicians or golfing gentlemen, managed to weave in the detail that the product was manufactured in a modern German chemical laboratory under the supervision of university-trained chemists. This was, in the European and American context of 1900, essentially a guarantee of quality. German chemistry had a reputation that is genuinely difficult to convey to modern readers. The great German universities had, over the previous 50 years, more or less invented organic chemistry as a discipline. German laboratories were producing a constant stream of useful new compounds and publishing their methods in German language journals that serious chemists everywhere felt obligated to learn to read. The country's pharmaceutical industry was ahead of its competitors by a margin that, in some product categories, could only be described as embarrassing. If you were an English or American consumer in 1900 and you were told that a medicine had been developed in a German laboratory, you could safely assume that it was at least as reliable as any medicine produced anywhere else in the world, and probably more so. Bayer leaned on this reputation with every advertisement, every press release, every product insert, and every medical journal submission. The company name itself, with its distinctly German sound, became part of the credibility package. Farbenfabriken Vormals Friedrich Bayer and Company was not exactly a name designed for casual conversation, which is why the advertisements usually shortened it to simply Bayer, but the full name appeared in fine print on every bottle, anchoring the product to its impressively industrial origin. The company also pioneered what we would now call content marketing, although in 1900 the activity did not yet have a name. Bayer's medical affairs department produced a steady stream of pamphlets, booklets, and small educational brochures, all aimed at informing the public or the medical profession about various aspects of respiratory health, pain management, and the modern pharmaceutical treatment of common complaints. The content of these materials was, by the standards of the era, genuinely educational. A pamphlet titled The Modern Understanding of the Common Cough, distributed free through pharmacies in 1902, contained roughly 20 pages of text explaining the physiology of the respiratory tract, the various types of coughs a person might experience, the typical causes of each, and the general principles of treatment. Only in the final 3 pages did the pamphlet quietly turn to a discussion of Bayer's Heroin as the recommended modern solution. A similar pamphlet on menstrual health, distributed through women's magazines in 1903, walked readers through 18 pages of respectful, surprisingly frank information about the menstrual cycle, before gently noting, in a closing section, that Bayer's Heroin had been found particularly effective for the relief of menstrual discomfort. These pamphlets were read with genuine interest by their target audiences, and they were passed around among friends and family members because they contained real information of real value. The advertisement at the end was simply the cost of admission, and it felt to the reader like a natural and trustworthy recommendation at the conclusion of an otherwise educational document. The free sample program was perhaps the most aggressive element of the whole machine. Bayer distributed staggering quantities of free heroin samples in the early years, and the scale of the operation is genuinely startling when you look at the numbers. Physicians in Europe and North America received, often unsolicited, small boxes of sample bottles through the post, together with informational literature and a prepaid response card inviting them to report on their clinical experience with the product. A physician who did respond would, more likely than not, receive additional samples, more elaborate literature, and, in some cases, an invitation to participate in a small paid study of the drug's applications in his particular specialty. A second tier of sample distribution ran through pharmacies, which received larger boxes of small trial-sized bottles that they were encouraged to include as a complimentary gift with any qualifying purchase. A customer buying a tube of toothpaste or a bottle of liniment might walk out of the pharmacy with a free sample of Bayer's heroin as a thank you for her patronage, along with a small leaflet explaining its uses. A third tier operated through grocers and general stores, particularly in smaller towns where a full-service pharmacy might not be available, allowing the product to reach households that would not otherwise encounter it. And a fourth tier, the most unusual, operated through direct consumer mail. Customers who wrote to Bayer with any question about any of the company's products would receive a personal reply signed by a member of the Medical Affairs Department, together with an assortment of relevant sample products. The letters of inquiry, carefully archived, also formed the nucleus of what would eventually become one of the first proper customer databases in the history of commercial pharmacy, although this was a side benefit that Bayer itself probably did not fully appreciate at the time. The medical profession was, if anything, even more thoroughly courted than the general public. Bayer sponsored medical conferences, underwrote scientific research, endowed lecture series at major universities, and quietly subsidized the publication costs of favorable studies in leading journals. Physicians who had published positive work on Bayer products often received follow-up invitations to speak at international conferences, all expenses paid, and to submit additional papers for consideration. This was not framed as a payment for favorable coverage, because to have framed it that way would have been crass and would also have failed. It was framed as scientific exchange, as the natural international flow of medical knowledge, as the responsibility of a leading manufacturer to support ongoing research in its field. The physicians involved genuinely believed they were participating in the advancement of science, and in many cases they were. The fact that the advancement of science happened to be aligning itself very conveniently with the commercial interests of a particular German pharmaceutical company was a detail that most participants preferred not to examine too closely. Incentive structures have a way of shaping what people think they are doing, and the incentive structures here were, to put it mildly, pointing in a very particular direction. The advertising reach extended into genuinely surprising corners of public life. Bayer sponsored, for example, a network of small community lending libraries, particularly in working-class neighbourhoods across several European cities, providing shelves of donated books to groups that could not otherwise afford them. Each library naturally featured a small Bayer cross on its front door and a rotating display of Bayer pamphlets in its entryway. The company also underwrote certain charitable health initiatives, donating product samples to orphanages, poorhouses, and mission hospitals. This was in one sense genuine philanthropy, and in another sense an extraordinarily effective form of product seeding that delivered the drug into the hands of vulnerable populations who would later, many of them, become dependent users. Nobody at Bayer, at least in the written records that survive, appears to have thought about it in quite those terms. The philanthropy was, in the company's own mind, philanthropy. That it also served as an unusually effective distribution strategy for a dependence-forming substance was not a connection that was being made in the boardroom. To be fair, the framework for even noticing that connection did not really exist yet. There is a particular category of advertisement from this era that deserves a close look, because it illustrates just how completely the drug had been normalized in the popular imagination. These are the general lifestyle advertisements, the ones that did not even bother to pretend they were about medical treatment. A typical example, which ran in several American women's magazines around 1904, featured a tasteful illustration of a smiling young mother reading a book in a sunlit sitting room, with her two children playing quietly at her feet. The copy read, in part, that the modern home was a place of calm, of order, of gentle routines, and that a small bottle of Bayer on the shelf was as essential to the well-run household as a reliable stove or a clean set of linens. The advertisement was not selling heroin as a treatment for any particular ailment. It was selling heroin as an accessory of domestic competence, as a marker of the kind of home a respectable family aspired to keep. This was lifestyle advertising in its purest form, executed decades before any advertising textbook would formally describe the concept, and aimed at a consumer product that was, as we now know, producing dependence in a meaningful fraction of the households it reached. Men's magazines ran parallel campaigns aimed at the professional class. An advertisement from 1905, appearing in a popular American periodical for businessmen, showed an illustration of a well-dressed gentleman seated at his writing desk, looking calm and purposeful, with a small bottle of Bayer visible on the corner of the desk beside his inkwell. The copy explained that the demands of modern professional life, with its endless commutes, its pressing deadlines, and its exhausting social obligations, placed enormous strain on the nervous system of the active man, and that Bayer's Heroin offered a tested and physician-approved way to maintain the calm focus and ready energy that business success required. The language is worth dwelling on for a moment. It does not describe the product as a drug at all. It describes it as a kind of professional tool, something a serious man keeps near his writing desk, alongside his fountain pen and his appointment book. The reader was being invited to see the drug as part of his identity as a capable modern professional, not as a medication he took when he was sick. And the invitation was being delivered with impeccable visual style, tasteful typography, and the reassuring authority of the Bayer cross in the lower right corner of the page. Children's advertising, which today is tightly regulated in most countries, was in 1900 completely unregulated and absolutely ferocious. Bayer produced what we would now call novelty merchandising aimed explicitly at the pediatric market. Colouring books featuring wholesome illustrations of happy children were distributed through pharmacies and mailed out to subscribers of various children's periodicals, each book including a small Bayer cross on the cover and a gentle reminder on the back page that mother kept a bottle of Bayer ready for when little coughs started. Trade cards, which were collectible illustrated cards that operated roughly the same way baseball cards would operate a few decades later, were issued in Bayer-branded series and traded enthusiastically by children in schoolyards. A particularly elaborate campaign in 1906 involved a set of collectible cards illustrating the animals of the world, numbered 1 through 50, distributed through pharmacies at the rate of 1 card per qualifying purchase, with an album available by mail for children who completed their set. The album, unsurprisingly, featured the Bayer cross prominently on every page, and included small educational notes that mentioned the company's various products. Children who grew up during this era arrived at adulthood with the Bayer cross as one of the most visually familiar symbols of their childhood, a symbol that carried warm associations of colouring books, collectible cards, cosy afternoons, and the gentle efficiency of a mother who knew what to do when someone got sick. This was not accidental. This was a generation being cultivated. Medical journals of the period, as noted earlier, ran enthusiastic reviews, but the depth and coordination of the journal coverage deserves a closer look because it was not simply a matter of a few positive articles. Bayer maintained an active program of what today would be called physician engagement, in which the company's medical affairs department tracked the publications of every notable physician in every major specialty across every significant journal in every language that mattered. When a physician published a positive clinical observation about any Bayer product, the company noted it, sent a polite letter of acknowledgement, and began the process of gently cultivating the relationship. When a physician expressed doubts or raised concerns, the company similarly noted it, but responded differently. The response might include an invitation to conduct a larger, better-funded trial of the product in question, or a carefully framed letter pointing out alternative interpretations of the data, or in some cases, a visit from a Bayer medical representative to discuss the physician's observations in person. The goal was not to silence dissent, which would have been impossible, but to shape the overall tenor of the professional conversation, to ensure that the doubters were outnumbered, outpublished, and generally overshadowed by a much larger and more coordinated chorus of enthusiasts. This was, by the standards of the era, an extraordinarily sophisticated influence operation. It would be recognizable to a modern public relations professional, almost without translation. The international reach of the campaign was the final piece of the puzzle. By 1905, Bayer had established subsidiary companies or exclusive distribution agreements in more than 40 countries, and in each territory the company tailored its marketing approach to local conditions while maintaining the core elements of the global identity. In the United States, the advertising adopted a slightly brasher, more exuberant American tone, emphasizing innovation and modernity. In Britain, the tone was more restrained, emphasizing scientific rigor and the Germanic precision of the manufacturing process. In France, the advertising emphasized elegance and sophistication, with particularly tasteful illustrations and a more literary writing style. In the colonial markets, in India and the Dutch East Indies and West Africa, the advertising was aimed primarily at European administrators and military officers, who served as the initial point of market entry, and from whose households the product eventually seeped into the broader colonial population. Everywhere, The Bayer cross remained the same. The logo was the company's one truly universal asset, and it appeared in identical form on every bottle in every language in every climate. A European colonial officer travelling from a posting in Singapore to a leave in London could walk into a pharmacy in either city and immediately recognise the product he needed, without having to read the label, because the symbol was already familiar to him. The uncomfortable fact about all of this is that the competence was not a mitigating factor. It was the problem. A less effective campaign would have sold less of the drug. Nearly every modern consumer advertising technique, consistent visual branding, professional endorsements, educational content as promotion, targeted lifestyle advertising, was pioneered or perfected by Bayer during the Heroin years. The playbook worked exactly as designed. The extraordinary skill of the marketing operation is what allowed the drug to become genuinely global, genuinely domestic, and genuinely ordinary. With consequences that would take another decade to fully reveal themselves. It is worth mentioning that a great many of these advertising materials have survived in archives, though often not by the direct efforts of Bayer itself. Medical libraries, historical societies, advertising trade archives, and private collectors have over the years preserved substantial quantities of the print campaigns, the trade cards, the pamphlets, the free sample boxes, the enamelled signs. Today, researchers can leaf through beautifully printed 1903 pharmacy catalogues and see the heroin listing sitting cheerfully between the cough drops and the tooth powders, or open a bound volume of The Lancet from 1902 and find the advertisement still cleanly legible a century and a quarter later. Looking at these materials now produces a very particular kind of vertigo. The advertising is genuinely beautiful. The type is elegant, the illustrations are tasteful, the language is polished, the whole presentation is by any aesthetic standard a pleasure to look at. And then, usually after a moment or two, the viewer notices what is actually being sold, and the aesthetic pleasure curdles into something more complicated. The campaigns were designed to make the product look exactly as safe and respectable as it appeared to be, and they did their job so well that more than a century later, you can still feel the intended effect working on you for a moment, before your rational mind catches up and reminds you what you are actually looking at. The pages of the journals carrying those enthusiastic reviews, the magazines carrying those golfing gentleman testimonials, the pharmacy catalogues carrying those matter-of-fact product listings, would, within 15 years, become distinctly embarrassing documents for everyone involved. Archivists at major medical libraries would begin, during the 1910s and 1920s, to quietly shelve certain volumes in less accessible sections, to lose certain bound issues during moves or renovations, to leave certain campaigns unrepaired when their bindings fell apart. Bayer itself, when the reckoning finally arrived, would scrub its own corporate history with remarkable efficiency, producing in subsequent decades a series of official company histories that gave ever briefer, ever more discreet mention to the heroin years, until by the second half of the 20th century the entire episode had been reduced, in Bayer's self-presentation, to a brief and regrettable footnote in an otherwise triumphant corporate narrative. The marketing operation that had worked so effectively to build the product had a quiet companion operation, decades later, working almost as effectively to make the product disappear from the public memory. The second operation was, in its own way, nearly as successful as the first. Most people today, hearing the word Bayer, think instantly of aspirin, and perhaps of the small round tablets their grandmother used to keep in a kitchen drawer. Almost nobody thinks of the amber glass bottles, the golfing gentleman, the children's colouring books, the collectible animal cards, the enamelled green and white signs swinging above every second pharmacy in the industrialised world. The cross is still there. The cross has always been there. But the thing the cross used to be stamped on has been, with admirable discretion, quietly removed from the picture. To fully appreciate what Bayer was doing with its elegant glass bottles and its carefully designed typography, we have to zoom out and look at the landscape the company was operating in. Because as polished as the Bayer operation was, it did not exist in a vacuum. It existed in what historians now politely describe as the golden age of patent medicine, which is a generous way of saying that the late 19th and early 20th centuries were, from a pharmaceutical perspective, an absolute free-for-all. If Bayer was the tasteful German professional at a formal dinner party, the rest of the industry was in many cases the guy at the next table trying to sell you something out of a suitcase. And this guy, it should be said, was doing remarkably well for himself. The term patent medicine is itself a little misleading, because most of the products marketed under this label were not actually patented. Patenting a medicine would have required the manufacturer to disclose the ingredients, which was precisely what the manufacturers had no intention of doing, since the ingredients were usually either cheap, dangerous, or both. What the manufacturers did instead was trademark the brand name and the packaging, which gave them exclusive rights to the pretty label without obligating them to tell anybody what was actually inside the bottle. The secrecy was considered a feature rather than a bug. A consumer in 1895 shopping for something to treat his persistent headaches was expected to trust the label, the testimonials, the illustrations, and the reputation of the druggist selling the product, and to accept as a general principle that the exact chemical composition of his remedy was none of his business. The industry had, over several decades, cultivated this attitude carefully, and it was making spectacular amounts of money. Walk into a general store or a pharmacy in any American town in 1898, and the sheer variety of medicinal products available for purchase would have been, by modern standards, staggering. The shelves carried hundreds of distinct brands, each with its own elaborately illustrated label, its own proprietary name, its own bold promises printed in colourful type. The variety was staggering: tonics, elixirs, syrups, liniments, pills, plasters, ointments, and a dozen other categories whose distinctions only specialists could explain. The product claims were almost uniformly extravagant. A typical label might promise to cure, in a single bottle, rheumatism, dyspepsia, scrofula, catarrh, liver complaint, kidney complaint, nervousness, sleeplessness, loss of appetite, loss of weight, loss of vigour, loss of hair, and a vague category referred to as female troubles, along with an implied promise of general rejuvenation that the label preferred not to be too specific about. The same bottle might also mention, in smaller type, that it was suitable for use in cases of whooping cough, croup, diphtheria, and infantile convulsions, because apparently if you were going to make grand claims you might as well include the children. The ingredients, to the extent that they could be determined by anyone who bothered to investigate, were a remarkable menagerie. A great many of the tonics consisted primarily of alcohol, in concentrations that would today qualify them as fortified wines. Several of the most popular products advertised specifically as beneficial for temperance-minded housewives turned out, on later analysis, to be stronger by volume than whiskey, which meant that women who were personally teetotal and lived in households where alcohol was forbidden were quietly consuming the equivalent of several stiff drinks a day in the form of their daily medicinal tonic. When the eventual chemical analyses were published, in the wave of muckraking journalism that swept American magazines in the early 1900s, the reactions ranged from bewildered to outraged to, in a certain number of cases, mildly amused. One particularly famous women's tonic, marketed for decades as a soothing aid to feminine health, turned out to be approximately 21% alcohol by volume, which was slightly stronger than sherry. The manufacturers, when confronted with this fact, explained that the alcohol was merely a preservative, which was technically true in the sense that alcohol does preserve things, although it also happens to preserve them by causing them to absorb a great deal of alcohol. Opium, in various forms and concentrations, was an even more common ingredient than alcohol in the cough and pain categories. Laudanum, which was tincture of opium, sat on household shelves right next to the cooking sherry. Products aimed specifically at quieting fussy infants featured opium prominently in their formulations, usually without saying so on the label. A particularly notorious category of products, marketed under a variety of cheerful names and sold primarily through general stores, was the teething syrup aimed at mothers of small children. These teething syrups did indeed calm teething babies, in the sense that they contained enough morphine to calm a moderately sized adult, and small children who received the recommended dose tended to become exceptionally peaceful, sometimes permanently so. The infant mortality statistics associated with the most popular teething products, when they were finally compiled in the first decade of the 20th century, were genuinely alarming, although the connection was slow to be made because infant mortality in general was high enough that a few thousand additional deaths attributable to a specific product tended to blend into the background noise of the era. Cocaine was another star performer. It was a relatively new pharmaceutical ingredient, having been isolated from the coca leaf in the middle of the 19th century and introduced into medical practice in the 1880s, when a young Viennese neurologist with a promising career ahead of him had published a series of enthusiastic papers describing its wonders. That young neurologist, whose name was Sigmund Freud, would later revise his views somewhat after watching several of his friends and patients develop catastrophic dependencies on the substance. But by that point, the commercial horse had well and truly bolted. Cocaine was showing up in everything. It was marketed as a cure for morphine dependence, which it genuinely did seem to solve in the short term by replacing the morphine dependence with a fresh cocaine dependence. It was marketed as a general energy tonic. It was marketed as a specific treatment for fatigue, for melancholy, for nervous exhaustion, for hay fever, for sinus congestion, for toothache, and for a variety of other complaints. A particularly successful cocaine-based product was a carbonated soft drink developed by an Atlanta pharmacist in 1886, which combined cocaine, caffeine, and sugar syrup, and was marketed initially as a brain tonic and temperance beverage. That product, after several reformulations to remove the cocaine in 1903, continues to be sold today, although the company that makes it has, understandably, spent the subsequent century not drawing particular attention to its early composition. You probably know which one. They sell it in red cans. Dental products were another area where cocaine enjoyed a thriving career. A popular line of children's toothache drops, marketed in American pharmacies in the 1880s and 1890s, consisted of a cocaine solution applied directly to the inflamed gums of small children. The product, which was sold openly with cheerful illustrations of beaming youngsters on the packaging, did indeed stop the tooth pain, because cocaine is in fact a highly effective topical anaesthetic, which is why it was eventually retained in medical practice for specific surgical applications long after its general consumer use was phased out. The problem, as you may have guessed, was that the standard dose applied to a small child's gums produced a variety of effects beyond simply numbing the pain, most of them undesirable. Parents reported that their children became, after treatment, unusually lively, unusually talkative, and unusually resistant to going to sleep. Some parents considered this a mild improvement over a crying child. Most pediatricians, by the mid-1890s, had started to have second thoughts about the whole arrangement, but the product remained on the market for several more years because market momentum is a powerful thing, and mothers knew what worked. Cannabis-based products occupied their own corner of the menu. Tincture of cannabis was a standard item in 19th century pharmacies, prescribed for a wide variety of complaints including migraine, insomnia, menstrual cramps, and what physicians delicately termed hysteria, which was the Victorian catch-all diagnosis for any female patient whose symptoms the doctor did not particularly want to investigate. Cannabis tinctures were also common ingredients in proprietary pain remedies and sleep aids, usually in combination with other more potent substances, because the prevailing philosophy in patent medicine formulation was that if one active ingredient was good, then 4 or 5 were surely better. Users of cannabis tinctures tended to report the expected range of effects, though historical accounts suggest that a significant fraction of the population discovered that the tincture they had been using for their migraines was also remarkably effective at making the weekly performance of their brother-in-law's amateur poetry readings considerably more bearable. Chemistry does find its audience. Beyond the standard opium, cocaine, and cannabis offerings, the shelves carried products containing a staggering range of additional curiosities. There were tonics based on strychnine, which is more commonly known today as a lethal rat poison, but which in small doses was believed to be a stimulant and was sold as a restorative for nervous debility. There were iodine-based tonics of various dubious compositions. There were mercury-based treatments, particularly for syphilis but also for general skin conditions, which slowly poisoned their users through heavy metal accumulation over months and years. There were products containing chloroform, which is a powerful anesthetic, as an ingredient in cough suppressants and headache remedies. There were products flavoured with oil of wintergreen, which is essentially concentrated methyl salicylate, chemically related to aspirin but much more potent and potentially dangerous in the quantities that some formulations contained. And there was a steady parade of ever more exotic ingredients whose medical value ranged from dubious to non-existent. Ground-up dried seahorses, pulverized pearls, tonics containing gold leaf, elixirs infused with radium, because radium was a new and fashionable discovery in the early 1900s, and was therefore considered healthful before anyone had quite worked out what radiation actually did to the human body. Radium, Newly discovered and fashionably scientific was briefly added to face creams, drinking water, and energy tonics before anyone quite worked out what radiation did to living tissue. Nobody involved in manufacturing these products thought of themselves as being particularly reckless. They were simply offering modern, scientifically enhanced consumer goods in the same cheerful entrepreneurial spirit that their competitors were applying to cocaine gum and morphine cough drops. The line between exciting new science and slow-motion consumer tragedy was, in that era, essentially invisible until it was far too late. Much of this was sold through travelling medicine shows, painted wagons rolling into small towns, pitchmen performing musical acts and comedy routines before launching into the sales speech. Others reached customers through mail-order catalogues, which delivered tonics and syrups to rural households alongside soap and flour. In both cases, the consumer had no way to verify what was in the bottle, and the manufacturer had no obligation to tell her. The manufacturer's return address, if the bottle had one at all, was a post office box in a city 3 states away. Their idea of customer service was absolutely take it or leave it. Alongside the travelling shows, there was also a thriving mail-order industry, which allowed manufacturers to reach customers in rural areas where no medicine show had ever ventured. The mail-order pharmaceutical business had been made possible by 2 late 19th century developments: the rural free delivery system that brought postal service to farmsteads far from the nearest town, and the illustrated mail-order catalogue that allowed consumers to browse a vast selection of goods from the comfort of their own kitchen tables. Several of the largest American mail-order houses included substantial pharmacy sections in their general catalogues, offering customers a wide range of patent medicines at attractive prices. A farmer in rural Kansas in 1895 could, with a single form and a few dollars, receive a shipment of tonics and syrups and pills and elixirs that would have been difficult to assemble from any single nearby pharmacy. The products were advertised with the same extravagant claims that characterized the rest of the industry, and they arrived in tidy parcels that carried the implicit endorsement of the mail-order house's brand, which tended to be considerable, since these were by this point some of the most trusted retail operations in the country. A shipment of morphine-laced cough syrup from a reputable mail-order catalogue felt, to a farm wife ordering supplies for the winter, roughly equivalent to a shipment of soap or flour. It was just another item on the list. Within this enormous and largely chaotic landscape, certain products managed to achieve genuine national prominence, and the stories of these star performers are worth a moment of attention because they illustrate how the whole system actually worked from the consumer's perspective. Take, as an illustrative case, a category of products known broadly as nerve tonics, which were marketed primarily to women and promised relief from the various ill-defined complaints that were understood at the time as nervous complaints. A nerve tonic was supposed to help a woman who felt run down, overwrought, exhausted by the demands of running a household, troubled by sleep, or simply not quite herself. The language used in the advertising was deliberately vague, because the wider the range of complaints the product could address, the larger the potential customer base. The active ingredients were equally vague and equally wide-ranging. A bottle of nerve tonic from one popular brand contained alcohol, small amounts of opium, a measure of vegetable extracts whose medical value was essentially zero, and a flavour syrup to disguise the whole mixture. A bottle of a competing brand contained alcohol, cannabis tincture, a small amount of cocaine, and similar flavour syrup. A third brand used alcohol, morphine, and a dose of strychnine, on the theory that the strychnine would act as a stimulant to counterbalance the sedative effect of the opium. Consumers typically had no way of knowing which brand they were purchasing, because the labels did not disclose ingredients, and consumers usually did not particularly want to know, because the general assumption was that the manufacturer had included whatever was necessary to produce the promised effect. The effect was, in most cases, genuinely pleasant, if one did not ask too many questions about what was causing it. The dead giveaway for a consumer, if anyone had been inclined to notice, was the common experience that a bottle of nerve tonic once begun tended to be consumed rather faster than the customer had originally anticipated. The first bottle, purchased for a specific episode of nervousness, would run out within a couple of weeks, and the customer would purchase a second bottle to finish what the first had started. The second bottle would also run out rather quickly. The third bottle would be replaced by a fourth, with a sense that somehow the tonic had become a more or less permanent fixture of the household. By the time the 6th or 7th bottle had been ordered, The customer had developed a relationship with her nerve tonic that would have been recognizable to any pharmacologist as something other than occasional medicinal use. But the customer herself, without the framework to name the experience, simply understood it as having found a product that worked. The manufacturers, who understood the pattern perfectly well, were happy to supply the increasing quantities. Good customer retention is, in any era, the foundation of a profitable consumer goods business. The regulatory environment in which all of this operated was, to be generous, embryonic. In the United States, there was essentially no federal oversight of pharmaceutical products until 1906, when the Pure Food and Drug Act was finally passed, and even that initial legislation was quite limited in scope. The Act required manufacturers to accurately label certain specified ingredients, including alcohol, morphine, opium, cocaine, chloroform, heroin, and a handful of others. It did not require pre-market safety testing. It did not prohibit the sale of any particular substance to any particular consumer. It did not require a prescription for any specific drug. It simply required that if the product contained certain ingredients, the label had to say so. This was, in its day, a genuinely significant piece of legislation, because it represented the first time the American federal government had asserted any authority at all over the pharmaceutical marketplace. But it was a long way from modern drug regulation. Similar developments occurred in Britain with a series of parliamentary acts through the early 20th century, in France under its own regulatory framework, and in Germany through the various imperial health ordinances. The general direction was the same everywhere, which was gradual and reluctant, and the pharmaceutical industry pushed back at every turn, with considerable resources and considerable persistence. What makes this patent medicine landscape particularly relevant to the heroin story is that it provided the perfect environment for Bayer's product to flourish, and it also provided the perfect camouflage. Consumers who were accustomed to buying bottles of mystery tonic from men in wagons and accepting the resulting effects without question had absolutely no framework for being suspicious of a professionally packaged pharmaceutical product from a respected German laboratory. Compared to the competition, Bayer's heroin was a model of transparency. The label clearly stated what the active ingredient was. The dosing instructions were printed in legible type. The manufacturer's name and address were prominently displayed. The whole presentation was so much more respectable than the surrounding market that it felt to consumers almost reassuring. If the wagon pitchman's bottle of mysterious green liquid was considered acceptable medicine, then surely the crisply labelled Bayer bottle, with its properly drawn molecular diagrams and its endorsements from actual physicians, was the height of pharmaceutical responsibility. Bayer did not need to compete with the snake oil salesman on their own terms. The snake oil salesman, by simply existing in such numbers and with such flamboyance, made Bayer look, by comparison, like the calmest and most trustworthy product on the shelf. There was also a subtler dynamic at work. The proliferation of patent medicines of wildly varying quality had, over several decades, trained the public to accept a certain philosophical position about pharmaceuticals, which was that feeling better was the primary measure of whether a product was working. The question of what a medicine was actually doing inside the body, at a chemical or physiological level, was generally considered the doctor's business rather than the patient's, and even doctors had, in many cases, imperfect knowledge of what their remedies were actually doing. The patient took the medicine, the patient felt better. That was the whole loop. The deeper question of whether the feeling better was the result of genuine healing, or merely the result of a substance that temporarily masked symptoms while potentially creating new problems underneath, was not one that the average consumer was equipped to ask. Bayer's heroin slotted perfectly into this worldview. It made patients feel better. Patients felt better very reliably, in fact, more reliably than with most of the alternatives. What more could anyone reasonably expect from a cough medicine? By 1905, the American and European pharmaceutical shelves contained literally thousands of distinct products, the vast majority of which contained one or more psychoactive or toxic ingredients, none of which was regulated in any meaningful way, and all of which were competing for the same consumer dollar. Into this cheerful pharmaceutical circus, Bayer had introduced a premium product with an extraordinary marketing budget, a genuinely sophisticated visual identity, and the full weight of the German pharmaceutical establishment behind it. The competition, from saloon bar tonics to mail-order syrups to wagon-mounted elixirs, actually helped rather than hurt. Bayer's heroin looked, felt, and behaved like a real medicine. precisely because the reference point against which it was measured was such an enormous field of dubious alternatives. A customer who was used to buying bottles of unregulated syrup from a man who danced on a stage with a pet raccoon was not going to worry about the chemical details printed on a handsome buyer package. The carnival eventually began to wind down, as carnivals tend to do, the muckraking journalism of the early 1900s, which exposed the actual ingredients and actual consequences of many popular patent medicines in a series of devastating magazine articles, did enormous damage to the industry's public trust. The passage of proper pharmaceutical regulation in the United States, Britain, and across Europe during the first 2 decades of the 20th century gradually closed off the most egregious practices. The medicine shows, unable to compete with the rising cost of compliance and the falling tolerance for their particular style of salesmanship, slowly disappeared from the landscape, the last of them lingering in rural America into the 1920s and 1930s before being replaced by more modern forms of commercial entertainment. The mail-order catalogues pared back their pharmacy sections as the regulatory burden increased. The proprietary tonics that had been household names for a generation quietly disappeared from the shelves, or reformulated themselves into something resembling ordinary modern consumer goods. And Bayer, which had been the most respectable player at the circus, emerged from the whole transition with its brand reputation not just intact, but actually enhanced, because the company had always presented itself as the responsible grown-up in a room full of questionable entrepreneurs. This was, in the short term, a genuinely clever position to occupy. In the longer term, as we're about to see, even Bayer's respectability would turn out to be insufficient protection, because the drug itself was going to start writing its own reviews, and the reviews were not going to be kind. The drug, as we have established, had spent roughly a decade as the most respectable miracle on the pharmacy shelf, but miracles tend to have a shelf life of their own, and by around 1910, a growing number of physicians and chemists across Europe and North America were beginning to notice that the miracle in question was developing some rather persistent asterisks. The asterisks had, in honesty, been there all along, but they had been politely ignored, misattributed, or filed under other headings. What changed in the early 1910s was not that new evidence suddenly appeared. What changed was that the existing evidence finally accumulated to a volume that could no longer be gracefully overlooked, and a handful of careful observers began to say out loud what a rather larger number of their colleagues had been privately suspecting for some time. The process of admission, like most scientific reckonings, was slow, awkward, and marked by a great deal of understandable reluctance on the part of people who had spent years recommending the drug to their patients. The first thing to understand about this reckoning is that it was, at root, a chemistry problem. For most of the decade in which heroin had been celebrated as a fundamentally new and improved compound, the actual chemical relationship between heroin and morphine had been understood in a somewhat hand-wavy manner by most practicing physicians. Pharmacology education in 1900 was not exactly what it is today. A typical medical school curriculum included a course or two on materia medica, which was essentially a catalogue of available drugs with notes on their recommended uses, and the theoretical framework for understanding how drugs actually worked in the body was, let us say, still under construction. Physicians who had completed their medical training in the 1880s or 1890s had generally learned that morphine was an alkaloid extracted from opium, that heroin was a newer synthesized compound that was in some way related to morphine, and that heroin was safer and better tolerated than morphine because the Bayer research had said so. The precise chemical relationship between the two molecules, the mechanism by which each interacted with the nervous system, the reason one produced dependence and the other supposedly did not, were questions that most practicing doctors had neither the time nor the training to investigate. They trusted the research. The research was published in respectable journals. That was for most purposes the end of the inquiry. The research itself, however, was being re-examined. A small but growing community of pharmacologists, particularly in Germany, France, and the United States, had spent the first decade of the 20th century quietly conducting more rigorous studies of what heroin actually was and what it actually did. Some of these researchers were working in academic laboratories, funded by national research councils or by charitable scientific foundations. Some were working in hospital pharmacies, studying the clinical records of their own patients. A few were working inside competing pharmaceutical companies, which had every commercial reason to understand exactly what Bayer's star product was doing in order to compete with it, replicate it, or, where possible, improve on it. These researchers were not motivated by any particular hostility to Bayer. They were simply doing the slow, patient work of rigorous pharmacology, a discipline that was itself maturing rapidly during the same period. And what they were finding, study after study, was that the official story about heroin was wrong in a specific and important way. The chemistry was, at the molecular level, not complicated, and by 1910 it had been worked out in sufficient detail that any competent chemist could read the papers and follow along. A molecule of morphine, the old familiar opium derivative that had been in medical use for nearly a century, has two hydroxyl groups, which are small chemical appendages consisting of one oxygen atom and one hydrogen atom, attached to specific positions on its carbon ring structure. These hydroxyl groups are important because they affect how the molecule behaves in the body, particularly how it moves through tissues and how it crosses into the nervous system. A molecule of heroin is chemically identical to morphine except for one specific modification. Those two hydroxyl groups have each been replaced by acetyl groups, which are slightly larger chemical appendages consisting of two carbon atoms and some oxygens and hydrogens. This is the same acetylation procedure we discussed earlier, the one that Bayer's chemists had applied so successfully to salicylic acid in producing aspirin. When you acetylate morphine, you get diacetylmorphine, which is the chemical name for heroin. The whole modification takes a competent chemistry student about 3 hours in a properly equipped laboratory, and the resulting compound differs from morphine, on paper, by a grand total of 4 small atom groupings. What nobody had fully appreciated in 1898, and what was becoming unmistakable by 1910, was that those 4 small atom groupings made a dramatic difference in how the drug actually behaved in the body, but not in the direction Bayer had originally claimed. The acetylation did not produce a fundamentally different drug. What it did was produce a version of morphine that was much more efficient at getting from the bloodstream into the brain. The human nervous system is protected from the general bloodstream by a specialized structure called the blood-brain barrier, which is a layer of cells designed to keep most foreign substances out of brain tissue. Different drug molecules cross this barrier at very different rates depending on their chemical properties. Morphine, as it happens, crosses the blood-brain barrier relatively slowly, because its hydroxyl groups make the molecule somewhat water-loving, and water-loving molecules do not easily pass through the fatty cell membranes of the barrier. Heroin, with those hydroxyl groups replaced by acetyl groups, is much more fat-loving and crosses the barrier perhaps 10 times faster. Once inside the brain, heroin is quickly converted back into morphine by enzymes in the brain tissue, because the acetyl groups are easily removed by the body's chemistry. The upshot is that heroin is essentially a delivery system for morphine. The user injects or swallows heroin, the molecule shoots through the blood-brain barrier with remarkable speed. The brain strips off the acetyl groups, and the person ends up with a large dose of morphine in their nervous system, much more rapidly than if they had taken plain morphine to begin with. This is, when you stop to consider it, a genuinely elegant piece of chemistry. And if the goal had been to design a more effective and more addictive opioid, Bayer's chemists could hardly have done a better job. Unfortunately, the goal had been precisely the opposite. Bayer had marketed heroin as a safer, less addictive alternative to morphine, and the actual chemistry was demonstrating quite clearly that heroin was in fact morphine with a turbocharger attached. The effects on the user were stronger, faster, and more pleasant, which meant that they were also, as any pharmacologist could now explain, more reinforcing and therefore more habit-forming. The entire pharmacological logic that Bayer had used to justify the original marketing claim, the idea that non-smoke drugs could not produce dependence, had been based on a crude and incorrect understanding of how addiction actually worked. Addiction, the researchers were now able to demonstrate, was a function of how the drug interacted with the brain's reward circuits, not of how the drug happened to enter the body. A drug that produced a rapid, intense pleasure in the brain would tend to be reinforcing regardless of whether it arrived via smoking, injection, oral consumption, or any other route. And heroin, it turned out, produced exactly that kind of rapid, intense pleasure in exactly the brain systems that drive addiction, and it did so more efficiently than morphine precisely because of the acetylation that was supposed to have made it safer. The researchers who first articulated this finding did so in a measured academic tone, as is the custom in scientific publication. The papers used careful language, qualified conclusions, acknowledged the limits of the available data, and generally avoided anything resembling alarm. But the content was, for anyone in the field, absolutely devastating. Article after article, appearing in the Archiv für experimentelle Pathologie und Pharmacologie, in the Journal of Pharmacology and Experimental Therapeutics, in the Annales de l'Institut Pasteur, and in other leading scientific publications of the period, demonstrated through careful experiment what the pharmacological community had been slowly realizing through clinical observation. Heroin was not a new drug. Heroin was morphine, delivered more efficiently, with all of morphine's familiar problems amplified. The original Bayer marketing was, in scientific terms, simply wrong, and the error was not a matter of interpretation or emphasis, but a matter of empirical fact. The emperor's new clothes, which had been admired for more than a decade, turned out to be the same clothes the emperor had been wearing all along, with some stitching added to make them look more modern. The response of the medical community to this growing body of evidence was, for the first few years, conspicuously muted. This is not especially surprising when you consider the position most physicians found themselves in. A general practitioner in Boston or Berlin or Manchester, who had spent the better part of a decade prescribing heroin to his patients, based on the authoritative guidance of the manufacturer and the endorsement of his professional journals, now had to confront the possibility that he had been, in effect, participating in a slow-motion pharmaceutical disaster. The patients he had treated for coughs were, in a significant fraction of cases, now dependent on the treatment. The children he had dosed for whooping cough were, in some households, now dealing with childhood cough remedies that the adults had begun borrowing. His entire professional practice had been, without his understanding it at the time, helping to entrench a public health problem that was about to become rather difficult to solve. The natural human response to this realization, unsurprisingly, was not to rush to announce it. The natural human response was to absorb the information slowly, privately, in conversation with trusted colleagues, while hoping that somebody else would bring the bad news to the public first. Clinical reports from this period capture the quiet dawning of recognition with considerable poignancy. A physician writing in a German medical journal in 1911 described what he called a phenomenon of progressive dose escalation among a small group of his long-term patients who had been prescribed heroin for chronic respiratory complaints. The patients, he noted, had begun their treatment at conservative doses recommended by the manufacturer. Over a period of 12 to 18 months, the doses required to produce the same therapeutic effect had increased gradually, but consistently, in some cases to levels 3 or 4 times the original prescription. When he had attempted to reduce the dosage or to substitute a different medication, several of the patients had experienced what he described delicately as marked distress, including sweating, tremor, cramping of the extremities, acute insomnia, and intense restlessness that required several days to subside. He did not, in the published version of his paper, use the word addiction. He used the phrase altered tolerance and dependence of a physiological nature, which was the careful scientific language of the period. But anyone reading his paper could see what he was describing. His patients had become addicted to their cough medicine, and he was, based on his tone, genuinely distressed to realize it. Similar reports began to appear from physicians in the United States, in Britain, in France, and in the Scandinavian countries. A London physician writing in 1912 described having identified, within his own practice, 19 patients whose relationship with their prescribed heroin had crossed into territory that he could no longer honestly describe as therapeutic. He wrote, with considerable candour for a medical publication of the era, that he had not initially recognized what was happening, that he had attributed the patients' increasing requests for prescriptions to the chronic nature of their underlying complaints, and that only when he had reviewed his files systematically had he seen the pattern. The pattern, once seen, could not be unseen. Once he began looking for it, he found it in nearly every case of long-term heroin prescription in his files. His conclusion, delivered in the polite language of Edwardian medicine, was that the assumptions on which the original prescribing practice had been based required substantial revision. The vocabulary to describe what physicians were observing began to coalesce during this same period. The word tolerance, in its specifically pharmacological sense, came into regular use to describe the body's tendency to require larger doses of a drug over time to achieve the same effect. The word dependence entered the medical lexicon to describe the physiological state in which a person's body had adapted to the presence of a drug in such a way that its absence produced distress. The word habituation, used in a somewhat different sense than it had been before, came to describe the patterned behavioral seeking of a drug, and the phrase loss of control, though it would take a few more years to become central to addiction medicine, was already appearing in clinical reports to describe the experience of patients who could no longer regulate their own consumption, despite a sincere desire to do so. None of these concepts were entirely new. Physicians had been describing similar phenomena in relation to opium and morphine for decades. What was new was the realization that heroin, which had been specifically marketed as an alternative to these problems, produced exactly the same problems, often in a more rapid and severe form. Laboratory researchers, meanwhile, were working on the problem from the other direction. Animal studies conducted in multiple academic laboratories during this period demonstrated, with what was by then becoming boring consistency, that experimental animals given regular doses of heroin developed the same patterns of tolerance and dependence that had long been documented with morphine. The animals required increasing doses over time. When the drug was withdrawn, they exhibited behavioral signs that were unmistakably consistent with what clinicians were observing in their human patients. A famous series of experiments conducted at a German university in 1913 involved rats that had been given regular heroin injections for several months and then abruptly switched to saline. The rats, the paper reported in its usual understated prose, exhibited marked behavioral changes including restlessness, tremors, piloerection, which is the technical term for raised fur, decreased food and water intake, and repetitive motor activity, all of which resolved upon reintroduction of the drug. The paper did not need to spell out the implications. The research community understood perfectly well that if a rat's entire life could be organized around the presence or absence of heroin, then the drug's interaction with the mammalian nervous system was not, as the biomarketing had claimed, benign. The genuinely awkward moment came when the scientific consensus had solidified to the point that it could no longer be contained within the professional literature. By around 1913, a significant number of papers had been published across multiple countries documenting the addictive potential of heroin, its pharmacological equivalence to morphine, its tendency to produce dose escalation in clinical practice, and the specific withdrawal syndrome experienced by patients attempting to discontinue use. The evidence was no longer scattered. It was no longer ambiguous. It was no longer something that a conscientious physician could reasonably set aside while continuing to prescribe the drug based on its original marketing claims. The professional position that Bayer's heroin was a safe and non-habit, forming cough remedy had, quietly but thoroughly, become scientifically untenable. What remained was the far more difficult question of what to do about it. Bayer's own response during this period was, to be polite, careful. The company did not publicly acknowledge that its flagship therapeutic claim had been shown to be wrong. Instead, the company adjusted its marketing language in stages, gradually, in ways that were designed to be noticed as little as possible. The explicit claim that heroin was non-habit forming began to appear less prominently in advertising materials. The recommendation for use in infants and small children was softened, then qualified, then eventually dropped from the official product literature, although it took several years and was not accompanied by any public explanation. The focus of the advertising shifted away from claims of safety and toward claims of efficacy. Physicians who wrote to the company inquiring about recent reports of dependence received letters that acknowledged certain isolated clinical observations, while emphasizing the continued utility of the product when used with appropriate care. The word care was doing considerable work in these letters. What it meant in practice was that Bayer was gradually shifting the responsibility for managing the drug's risks from the manufacturer, which was no longer willing to guarantee safety, to the prescribing physician, who was now expected to be aware of the risks and to exercise his own judgment. This was, in commercial terms, a skillful maneuver. In medical terms, it represented a quiet but complete reversal of the original marketing position, executed so gradually that neither the public nor, in many cases, the prescribing physicians themselves fully registered what had happened. Heinrich Drieser, the pharmacological director whose endorsement had launched heroin on its commercial career, largely retired from public commentary on the subject during this period. His health, as noted earlier, had been declining for some time. His professional reputation, which had once rested considerably on the successful introduction of heroin, was now quietly being reframed by his colleagues, who preferred to emphasize his contributions to the development of other bioproducts, particularly aspirin. The historical record on Drieser's own views of the mounting evidence against heroin is thin, because he left relatively few written reflections on the subject, but what evidence exists suggests that he understood perfectly well what the laboratory and clinical data were showing. He simply chose, in the manner of many distinguished elderly scientists who discover late in their careers that they have been wrong about something significant, to say very little. He died in 1924 of what was recorded as a stroke, though the role of his own long-term use of opioids in contributing to his declining health has been a matter of historical speculation ever since. The man who had approved heroin as a safe replacement for morphine spent his final years with the tools of his own pharmacy, never far from his bedside, and his silence on the question of what he had launched is itself, in a certain way, its own kind of testimony. The broader Bayer corporate response was also shaped by external pressures that had nothing to do with heroin specifically. The company was, during this period, undergoing significant internal reorganization as part of its gradual transformation from a dye manufacturer with a pharmaceutical sideline into a pharmaceutical giant with a dye sideline. The financial performance of the pharmaceutical division had become, by 1912, the most important driver of the company's overall profitability, and within the pharmaceutical division. The commercial logic for Bayer was to pivot toward aspirin as the public face of the company, while allowing heroin to gradually recede into a supporting role, without making any public acknowledgement that the second product had been a problem. This pivot was executed with considerable skill over the following decade, and it forms part of the reason that modern consumers, as we noted earlier, tend to associate the Bayer name almost exclusively with aspirin. The scientific reckoning, meanwhile, was beginning to shift the public conversation in ways that Bayer could not control. The growing consensus within the medical profession was beginning to leak into broader public discussions, first through general interest magazine articles aimed at educated readers, then through newspaper reports on particular cases, and finally through the early stirrings of the political debate that would eventually produce the first major drug control legislation in the United States and Britain. Physicians who had once been comfortable prescribing heroin freely began to exercise more caution. Pharmacists began to ask more questions when customers requested refills. Parents who had casually dosed their children with the Bayer product a few years earlier began, as the drug's reputation shifted, to quietly put the bottles away in a drawer. The change was gradual and uneven. In some communities, particularly in rural areas or in parts of the world where medical information travelled slowly, the old reassuring assumptions about the drug persisted for years after the scientific consensus had turned. But the direction of the shift was unmistakable, and by around 1914 or 1915, the cultural status of heroin had begun a decisive transformation from respectable household remedy towards something considerably more ambiguous. The emotional quality of this transition, both for individual physicians and for the broader medical profession, was something like the quiet shame that settles over any institution that slowly realizes it has been wrong about something important. There were no dramatic confessions. There was no single moment of reckoning. There was simply a gradual, uncomfortable, largely private acknowledgement among thousands of practicing doctors that the professional recommendations they had been giving for more than a decade had been based on incomplete information, that the patients they had been trying to help had, in many cases, been harmed instead, and that the path forward would involve some difficult conversations with those patients and some even more difficult revisions to standard clinical practice. The medical profession did not, on the whole, handle this transition gracefully. Few professions in any era handle such transitions gracefully. There were physicians who continued to prescribe heroin at pre-reckoning levels for years after the evidence had turned, either because they had not kept up with the journals or because they genuinely did not want to believe what the evidence showed. There were physicians who overcorrected, refusing to prescribe any opioid for legitimate patients in severe pain because they had become spooked by the heroin experience. There were physicians who quietly adjusted their prescribing practices without ever mentioning the reasons to their patients, who thus received mysteriously different recommendations from their doctors without understanding why the advice had changed. All of these responses were, in their own ways, understandable human reactions to a professionally awkward situation. The scientific reckoning also marked the beginning of a shift in how addiction itself was understood. For most of the 19th century, the phenomenon of drug dependence had been understood primarily as a moral failing, a weakness of character on the part of the individual user who had allowed himself to fall into habit. The heroin experience, by demonstrating that dependence could develop reliably and predictably in anyone who took a sufficiently potent substance often enough, including respectable middle-class housewives, responsible professional men, and small children, forced a gradual reconsideration of this moral framework. Addiction, the research of this period was demonstrating, was a pharmacological phenomenon with a clear biological basis. It could happen to anyone. It was not a character defect. It was a predictable consequence of exposing the mammalian nervous system to certain substances under certain conditions, and the substance itself was doing most of the work. This was a genuinely significant conceptual shift, and its implications would continue to unfold over the rest of the 20th century, reshaping how societies thought about drug users, how medical professionals approached treatment, and how policymakers attempted to regulate the pharmaceutical marketplace. The shift was far from complete in 1913. It is, in many important respects, still ongoing today. But the early stirrings of the modern understanding of addiction began in precisely these years, in the quiet corners of German, French, British, and American laboratories, where careful researchers were patiently documenting what a widely prescribed cough remedy was actually doing to the people who took it. The myth of the safe alternative was officially over. What was going to come next, for the drug, for its users, and for the broader culture that had embraced it so enthusiastically, was a story that would turn out to be considerably messier than the story that had come before. The scientific reckoning in the laboratories was one thing. What happened in living rooms, dining rooms, and family parlours was quite another. And in some ways it was the more consequential story. Because while pharmacologists were quietly publishing papers, and physicians were quietly revising their prescribing habits, millions of ordinary households across Europe and North America were, for the first time, being forced to confront what actually happened when a regular user of Bayer's cough remedy went a day or two without her accustomed drops. The answer, as it turned out, was rather alarming. And unlike the scientific evidence, which could be absorbed or ignored at a professional distance, the experience of watching a family member go through withdrawal was almost impossible to misinterpret. It happened at the breakfast table. It happened in the hallway outside the bedroom. It happened in full view of children, spouses, servants, neighbours, and anyone else who happened to be present when the morning dose failed to arrive. The clinical description of the opioid withdrawal syndrome had been developing slowly in the medical literature for decades before heroin made it a household concern. Physicians who had treated morphine-dependent patients, particularly the large populations of Civil War veterans on both sides of the Atlantic, who had come home from military hospitals with what was politely called the soldier's disease, had been describing the phenomenon in their case notes and clinical papers since the 1870s. But the descriptions had been scattered, inconsistent, and often filed under other diagnostic categories. Some physicians described the syndrome as a form of neurasthenia. Others categorized it under hysteria, which was the standard catch-all for any unexplained physical symptom that appeared in a female patient. Still others described it in frank moralistic terms as the just consequences of moral weakness, without examining the specific physiological mechanisms involved. The result was a medical literature that contained a great deal of information about withdrawal, scattered across a great many different headings but no coherent, consolidated clinical picture that a practicing physician could easily consult. The heroin experience changed that. By around 1912 or 1913, the number of dependent patients presenting at medical offices had grown large enough, and the patterns of their symptoms were consistent enough, that a proper clinical description of the withdrawal syndrome began to emerge in a more systematic form. The physicians who compiled these descriptions were not, on the whole, working in specialist addiction medicine, because the field of specialist addiction medicine did not yet exist. They were general practitioners and hospital physicians who found themselves dealing with increasing numbers of patients whose primary complaint was, when examined closely, the physiological consequences of trying to stop taking a drug that had been prescribed to them as safe. The clinical descriptions that emerge from these observations are remarkable documents, partly because they represent the first time the withdrawal syndrome had been described with clinical precision for a broad medical audience, and partly because the physicians writing them were clearly struggling to find language that was simultaneously scientifically accurate and humanly compassionate. The core features of the syndrome, as these early descriptions laid them out, were consistent enough across patients that they could be catalogued with some confidence. In the first 12 hours after a missed dose, patients typically experienced a gradual onset of restlessness, anxiety, and what several physicians described as a profound sense of unease that was difficult for the patient to articulate precisely. This initial phase was often mistaken, by the patient herself and by her family, for simple irritability or a particularly bad mood. By the 12 to 24-hour mark, the symptoms had typically intensified and begun to acquire distinctive physical features. Patients reported watery eyes, a runny nose, yawning that could not be suppressed, and a clammy perspiration that broke out even in cool rooms. The phrase cold sweat appeared so regularly in clinical notes of this period that it effectively entered the language in its modern sense during these years. The skin often developed what physicians called goose flesh, which is the raised, bumpy appearance produced when the tiny muscles at the base of each hair contract, and which was so characteristic of the withdrawal state that the experience of quitting opioids acquired a nickname derived from it in English, which you can probably guess. The physical symptoms intensified further over the second day. Patients reported deep muscular aches, particularly in the back and in the legs, that could not be relieved by any available treatment short of resuming the drug. The leg symptoms were particularly striking and gave rise to another durable linguistic legacy. Patients described involuntary kicking motions, spasms, and a peculiar restless tingling in the leg muscles that seemed to demand movement for relief. This phenomenon was common enough that it contributed directly to an enduring English phrase used to describe abrupt discontinuation of a drug or habit, a phrase that historians of slang have traced with reasonable confidence to exactly this clinical context. The association between opioid withdrawal and the leg symptoms was strong enough that several 19th century medical textbooks had already noted it, but the heroin generation of patients brought the phenomenon to widespread public awareness in a way it had not been before. Alongside the muscular symptoms came a cluster of gastrointestinal complaints that could be, in their own right, debilitating. Patients experienced severe abdominal cramping, persistent nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, often simultaneously. Appetite disappeared almost entirely. Sleep became impossible, not merely difficult but genuinely unachievable, with patients describing a peculiar state of profound exhaustion combined with an inability to drift off, as though the body had forgotten how. The pulse ran fast, blood pressure tended to rise, body temperature fluctuated erratically, anxiety reached levels that several physicians described as indistinguishable from severe mental crisis. And running underneath all of these symptoms was the overwhelming, almost geological pull of craving, the body's demand for more of the substance it had come to depend upon, a demand that the patient could not silence through willpower, through distraction, through any available exercise of self-discipline. Patients described the craving in language that their physicians found both moving and slightly alarming, as a kind of thirst that was not a thirst, a hunger that was not a hunger, a need that came from somewhere deeper than the ordinary needs of the body, and that would not be reasoned with. For most patients, the acute phase of the syndrome ran its course over roughly 7 to 10 days, with the peak of misery typically occurring between the second and fourth days. After the first week, the more dramatic physical symptoms gradually subsided, although a longer-lasting set of secondary symptoms, including persistent sleep disturbance, low-grade depression, general fatigue, and intermittent cravings, could continue for weeks or months. None of this, it should be stressed, was life-threatening in the immediate sense that withdrawal from alcohol or certain sedatives can be, a fact that later clinicians would use to distinguish opioid withdrawal from the more medically dangerous forms. But the acute opioid syndrome was nonetheless profoundly unpleasant, and patients who experienced it once were generally highly motivated to avoid experiencing it again. The motivation to avoid withdrawal was, as the physicians of this period began to recognize itself a central driver of continued use. The patient who had developed a dependence on her cough remedy was no longer taking the remedy primarily because it relieved her cough. She was taking it because not taking it felt, in her own words, like the worst illness of her life. The clinical descriptions, as they accumulated in the medical literature, were sobering. The experience inside ordinary households was, if possible, even more so. Consider, as an illustrative example, the situation that developed in 1,000 or so respectable middle-class homes in which an older female relative, living with a family for reasons of economy or family duty, had been quietly using her cough drops for several years. This was an extremely common domestic arrangement in the early 20th century. Unmarried aunts, widowed mothers, spinster cousins, and other categories of unattached older women frequently lived as members of the extended households of their nephews, sons, or more distantly related family heads, and they often occupied themselves with light domestic duties and social activities, while being supported by the household's primary wage earner. An aunt of this description, let us call her Aunt Margaret, might have begun taking Bayer's cough remedy in 1902 for what had seemed to be an ordinary winter cough. By 1912, a decade of daily use later, Aunt Margaret had become, without anyone in the household quite realizing it, a regular and dependent user of the drug. Her morning drops were as much a part of the household routine as the morning tea. They had been part of the routine for so long that nobody thought about them particularly, until, for whatever reason, they were not. The reasons varied. In some households, a new physician had reviewed Aunt Margaret's prescriptions and quietly declined to renew them, in keeping with the profession's shifting views on heroin prescribing. In others, a conscientious family member had read one of the early magazine articles about the drug's newly recognized dangers and had decided to remove the bottle from the household. In others, the local pharmacy had run out of stock, or Bayer had changed its distribution arrangements, or the war had disrupted supply chains. The reasons for the interruption mattered less than the fact of the interruption itself. For Aunt Margaret, the consequences were immediate and unmistakable. The family, which had grown accustomed to her particular personality over the preceding decade, watched in a mixture of alarm and confusion as that personality underwent a temporary but dramatic transformation. Aunt Margaret, who'd been mild, pleasant, occasionally drowsy but otherwise perfectly companionable, became within 24 hours a woman her family did not recognize. She was agitated, physically ill, emotionally distressed, and desperate for the return of her drops. She begged, she demanded, she wept, she argued, she took to her bed, she refused to take to her bed. She made the entire household revolve around the fact of her distress, because there was no way for her not to, and the family, which had no prior experience of anything resembling this phenomenon, responded with the full spectrum of bewildered human reactions that such a situation can produce. The family conversations that followed, conducted in low voices in kitchens and parlours and corridors, form a characteristic feature of this period. The whispers at the dinner table, the awkward consultations between adult family members, the quiet sending away of the children so that grown-up discussions could be had without alarming them, the careful wording of the next morning's visit to the physician, all became part of the texture of early 20th century family life in a way that had not been true a decade earlier. The dependence could be managed, either by carefully tapering the dose over several weeks, or in some cases by simply restoring the original prescription and continuing the treatment, which was still considered acceptable practice for elderly patients whose remaining years were not expected to be many. The family was reassured to some extent by having a medical framework to understand what they had been witnessing, but they were also, in a quieter way, deeply unsettled. The substance that had sat innocently on their shelf for 10 years, that they had cheerfully administered to children and recommended to neighbours, had just demonstrated itself to be something rather different from what they had believed it to be. The social consequences of these household experiences rippled outward in ways that were, at first, private, and then increasingly public. Women compared notes with their friends over tea, more discreetly now than they had a decade earlier. Mothers examined their medicine cabinets with a new sort of wariness. Fathers, who'd often been less directly involved with the dosing of children and the management of household remedies, asked their wives pointed questions about what exactly had been in that bottle that little Edward had been given every evening for the past 3 years. Grown siblings wrote letters to each other describing similar experiences in their own households, often with a tone of slightly embarrassed relief at discovering that they were not alone. The word habit, which had once been used casually and without particular alarm, began to acquire a new weight. To say that Aunt Margaret had a habit, in 1913, was no longer an innocent description of a daily routine. It was a coded acknowledgement that something had gone wrong, that the family was dealing with a problem that required management, and that the problem had a specifically pharmaceutical character. The language was shifting, and with it the cultural status of the bottle on the shelf. The newspapers, sensing a developing story, began to cover the subject with increasing frequency and with an increasingly moralistic tone. The first wave of journalistic coverage, which appeared in the general interest press between about 1912 and 1915, was relatively restrained, focused primarily on informing the reading public of the emerging medical consensus and on reporting the growing calls for regulation from various medical and civic organizations. But a second wave, which gathered momentum through the middle of the decade, was considerably more dramatic in tone. Newspapers began to print case studies of particularly striking examples of dependence, often accompanied by photographs of the afflicted individuals and their families. Magazines ran feature articles with titles that emphasized the scale of the problem and the urgency of the response. Popular writers began to produce books and pamphlets on the subject, most of them aimed at a general readership and most of them written with a considerable emotional charge. The drug that had been celebrated a decade earlier as a triumph of modern pharmaceutical science was now being described, in increasingly purple prose, as a menace to the moral fibre of the nation, a threat to the sanctity of the home, and a scourge that demanded immediate and comprehensive action. The fact that the scourge in question had been sitting on most readers' own medicine shelves for the previous 10 years, cheerfully administered by the readers themselves, was generally not emphasized in these accounts. The new moral panic required a clean narrative, and the clean narrative worked better if the villain was positioned as something alien that had somehow invaded respectable households, rather than as something respectable households had been actively welcoming through the front door for years. The stigma that developed in this period around both the drug and its users had a particular shape that is worth examining, because the shape of the stigma would turn out to have lasting consequences. The households that had been using the drug most heavily were, on average, respectable middle-class households with the resources to afford daily pharmaceutical expenditures and with the cultural inclination to trust professionally marketed modern remedies. When these households discovered that they had been, in effect, cultivating drug dependence in their own parlours, the psychological response was often a combination of denial and projection. It was difficult for a respectable family to accept that Aunt Margaret or Uncle Henry or Cousin Elizabeth had developed a genuine drug problem of the sort that, in the newspapers and public imagination, was associated with rough characters and disreputable neighbourhoods. So the family, rather than accepting this framing, tended to construct a story in which their own relative was an exceptional and regrettable case, a victim of circumstances, a person of fundamentally good character who had been ill-used by a deceptive manufacturer. The dependent person down the street, meanwhile, in the less prosperous neighbourhood, was a different matter entirely. That person, about whom one did not have direct personal knowledge, was clearly a different kind of case, belonging to a different kind of category, deserving a different kind of treatment. The moral vocabulary that developed during this period to describe drug dependence came to be applied very differently to different populations, with respectable middle-class dependents generally described as patients or sufferers in need of medical help, and poorer or more socially marginal dependents generally described as addicts or degenerates in need of containment. The distinction had no basis in the actual pharmacology, since the drug worked on everybody's nervous system in the same way. It had a great deal of basis in the social dynamics of the period, and it would shape the development of drug policy in both Europe and North America for decades to come. The retreat of the drug from its prominent household position was, during these years, quiet but comprehensive. The amber bottle that had once sat on the parlour mantelpiece between the grandmother's photograph and the china shepherdess was gradually moved, first to a less conspicuous shelf, then to a drawer, then to the back of a cabinet. In some households, the bottle was disposed of entirely, emptied down the drain by a family member who had decided to take definitive action on the matter. In others, the bottle remained, but its use became private, furtive, and carefully timed to moments when other family members were not present. The social geography of the drug was shifting. What had been a public household product, casually administered and cheerfully discussed, was becoming a private, personal product, secretly consumed and quietly denied. This shift from public to private use had important consequences for the medical understanding of the problem, because it meant that physicians and researchers were, from around 1915 onward, increasingly unable to get a clear picture of the actual prevalence of heroin use in the general population. People who continued to use the drug had every reason to hide the fact from their doctors, from their employers, from their social circles, and sometimes from their own families. The drug, having begun its commercial career as an advertisement for domestic modernity, was now completing its commercial career as a secret kept in a locked drawer. The transformation of the word addict during this period is itself worth a moment of attention. In the 19th century, the word had been used relatively loosely to describe anyone who had become strongly attached to a particular practice or substance. A person could be described, without negative connotation, as an addict of chess, an addict of Shakespeare, or an addict of afternoon naps. The word carried a connotation of devotion, of being given over to something, rather than of moral failure. By around 1920, in English language usage, the word had narrowed dramatically. It now referred almost exclusively to people dependent on specific narcotic substances, primarily opioids, and it carried heavy connotations of moral and social failure. The shift in usage was remarkably rapid, occurring over roughly 15 years, and it tracked the shift in public attitudes toward the heroin generation of dependent users. A word that had once described enthusiasm had become a word that described affliction and, worse, affliction understood as moral failing. Similar shifts occurred in the French, German, Italian, and Scandinavian languages during the same period, each language developing its own specific vocabulary for the new cultural category of the drug-dependent person, each vocabulary carrying its own specific freight of stigma and moral judgment. The country, and in fact several countries simultaneously, had come to a difficult realization by the middle of the decade. The miracle product was a problem. The problem was present in millions of households. The problem had been placed in those households by the active encouragement of the medical profession and the advertising industry, and nobody at any level of society had a good plan for what to do about it. The physicians could treat individual patients, but they could not reach the millions who were quietly managing their dependence without medical supervision. The manufacturer could reformulate its product or quietly withdraw it from certain markets, but it could not undo the dependencies that had already been established. The government could, in theory, regulate the drug more tightly, but regulation itself raised difficult questions about what to do with the existing dependent population, many of whom were respectable citizens who had broken no laws. The newspapers could call for action, but the action they called for tended to vary from day to day and from editorial to editorial, reflecting the genuine confusion of the period. The country was, in short, watching its miracle go sour in slow motion, with no particular plan for how the story was supposed to end. The atmosphere inside households, inside physicians' offices, and inside the public discourse was one of gradually mounting unease. The cheerful confidence of 1903, when Bayer's product had been the happy centerpiece of modern domestic medicine, had given way by 1915 to something considerably more ambivalent. Family members watched each other for signs of dependence. Physicians reviewed their own prescribing records with private discomfort. Journalists hunted for ever more alarming case studies. Legislators began to draft bills. Pharmacists began to keep lists of customers whose purchasing patterns had started to seem concerning. The entire apparatus of modern society that had spent 15 years celebrating a pharmaceutical innovation was now beginning, awkwardly and unevenly, to organize itself for the purpose of undoing the consequences of that celebration. What would come of the effort remained very much an open question. The answer, as we'll see, would take several decades to work itself out, and it would involve a series of legal, cultural, and medical transformations that would reshape not only the specific problem of heroin, but the much broader question of how modern societies handled psychoactive substances in general. The bottle was leaving the mantelpiece. Where it was going next was going to turn out to be somewhere considerably more complicated than anyone in 1915 could have predicted. The drug was in a drawer. The public mood had shifted. The medical profession had quietly rewritten its guidance. And yet, at the start of 1914, heroin remained legally available across most of the industrialized world with essentially the same regulatory status it had enjoyed since its launch. You could still walk into a pharmacy in New York, Paris, London, Berlin, Melbourne, or Buenos Aires and purchase a bottle, often without a prescription, sometimes without even the raised eyebrow of the pharmacist who had served you. The cultural status of the drug had turned, but the legal status had not. This gap between cultural attitude and legal framework is a characteristic feature of any substance whose reputation has soured faster than the laws have caught up, and it is a gap that tends, sooner or later, to be closed by the slow machinery of legislation. Between 1914 and the mid-1920s, that slow machinery finally got around to closing the heroin gap, and the process by which it did so reshaped not only the specific question of what to do about one particular drug, but the much larger question of how modern states would manage psychoactive substances for the rest of the 20th century. The starting gun for the modern drug control era was fired in the United States, which is, in itself, a slightly surprising fact. The United States in the early 1900s was, in most regulatory matters, a comparatively laissez-faire jurisdiction, rather less willing than its European counterparts to have the federal government dictate what citizens could and could not purchase at their local stores. But the United States also had a peculiar combination of factors that made drug regulation politically irresistible by around 1913. There was a growing progressive movement that believed, as a matter of general principle, in using federal power to clean up the various messes produced by unregulated commerce. There was a vocal public health community that had spent the preceding decade documenting the scale of the narcotics problem and lobbying for federal action. There was a diplomatic consideration, which we will come to in a moment, involving American commitments at international conferences on the opium trade. And there was, unsurprisingly, a considerable element of racial and cultural anxiety that attached itself to drug regulation during this period, with lurid public discussions about which population groups were supposedly most endangered by drug use, and which were supposedly most responsible for spreading it. The combination of these forces produced, in December 1914, the passage of a piece of legislation called the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, named for the congressman from New York who had shepherded it through the legislative process. The Harrison Act was, on the surface, a tax law rather than a prohibition law. The American federal government in 1914 did not possess, in the view of constitutional lawyers of the period, the authority to directly regulate the sale of consumer products within individual states. What it could do was impose taxes, and taxes could be structured in ways that impose significant compliance requirements on the people and businesses involved. The Harrison Act took this approach. Anyone involved in the importation, manufacture, sale, or distribution of opium or coca products, which included morphine, heroin, cocaine, and various related substances, was required to register with the federal government, to pay an occupational tax, to maintain detailed records of all transactions, and to operate only through channels that were accountable to federal inspection. The ordinary retail customer was not directly prohibited from obtaining these substances, but the substances themselves could now be obtained only through properly registered medical and pharmaceutical professionals operating within a paper trail that allowed federal authorities to track, in principle, every gram of the regulated drugs that moved through the American economy. The effect, while technically a matter of taxation and registration, was functionally equivalent to a comprehensive prescription requirement, combined with a federal monitoring system. The drugs had not been banned. They had been, in the American legal vocabulary of the period, brought under control. The interpretation of what exactly the Harrison Act meant in practice took several years to settle. The original text of the law was sufficiently ambiguous that early court decisions went in several different directions, and pharmacists, physicians, and federal authorities all had to work out, through a series of lawsuits and regulatory pronouncements, how the new framework actually operated. One question of particular significance was whether a physician was permitted to continue prescribing narcotics to a patient whose primary condition was dependence on those same narcotics. In other words, could a doctor legally maintain a dependent patient on heroin or morphine as a form of long-term treatment, rather than attempting to force the patient through a difficult and often unsuccessful withdrawal? The initial answer, worked out through a series of court cases over several years, was essentially no. The courts concluded that prescribing narcotics to sustain a dependence was not a legitimate medical purpose under the terms of the Harrison Act, and physicians who did so could be prosecuted. This interpretation, which was not inevitable from the text of the law, had enormous consequences. It meant that the existing population of dependent patients, which numbered in the hundreds of thousands across the United States, suddenly found themselves unable to obtain their substance through legal channels. The logical consequences of this situation, which should have been foreseeable to anyone who thought about the matter for a moment, followed exactly as logic would predict. The patients did not stop being dependent, they simply stopped being legal. The British response to the same constellation of concerns unfolded on a somewhat different timeline and through a somewhat different mechanism. The United Kingdom had been party to the international diplomatic discussions about opioid control that had been ongoing since the International Opium Convention at The Hague in 1912, and it had committed, along with the other major powers, to implementing domestic legislation that would give effect to the Convention's provisions. The First World War, which began in August 1914, delayed the implementation of this commitment, but it also created new domestic concerns about narcotic availability that pushed the issue back onto the political agenda. During the war, there were persistent reports of soldiers and officers obtaining cocaine and opioid products through unregulated channels in London, which the military authorities considered a matter of discipline and operational security. The emergency wartime regulations that were imposed to address this concern, under the Defence of the Realm Act, provided a template for more permanent legislation after the armistice. In 1920, the British Parliament passed the Dangerous Drugs Act, which imposed a prescription and registration framework on heroin, cocaine, morphine, and other specified substances. The British approach, somewhat notably, retained more flexibility for physicians to prescribe maintenance doses to dependent patients than the American approach did, a distinction that would persist for decades and that would produce meaningfully different outcomes for dependent populations on the two sides of the Atlantic. British physicians, operating under what came to be known informally as the British system, could continue to prescribe controlled quantities of opioids to long-term dependent patients under medical supervision, an approach that kept a portion of the dependent population within the legitimate medical system rather than pushing them entirely into an emerging illegal market. The German response to the heroin question was complicated, unsurprisingly, by the fact that Germany was the original manufacturer of the drug and had significant domestic economic interests in the continued production and sale of pharmaceutical opioids. German regulation of narcotic substances had existed in various forms since the late 19th century, but it had been focused primarily on quality control and labelling rather than on restricting availability. The German pharmaceutical industry, including Bayer, had significant influence over the shape of any legislation that would affect its products, and the resulting German framework, which evolved through a series of imperial and then Weimar-era regulations, tended to preserve the legitimate pharmaceutical market for these substances, while imposing increasing controls on their distribution to consumers. Germany eventually adopted a prescription requirement for heroin, but the enforcement of that requirement was uneven, and German domestic consumption of heroin through medical channels remained substantial through the 1920s and into the 1930s. The various national approaches, as they developed through the second decade of the 20th century, share a common direction of travel but differ significantly in their specific mechanisms and in the degree of restriction they imposed, reflecting the different political traditions, industrial interests, and public health concerns of each country. The broader international framework that tied these national efforts together was developed through a series of diplomatic conferences, beginning with the International Opium Commission, held in Shanghai in 1909, and continuing through the International Opium Convention signed at The Hague in 1912. The Hague Convention was the first international treaty to address the production and trade in opium derivatives and related substances, and it committed the signatory nations to implementing domestic legislation that would control the manufacture, distribution, and use of these drugs. The convention itself was somewhat vague on specifics, leaving considerable discretion to each signatory nation on how exactly to implement its obligations, but it established the principle that narcotic substances were a matter of legitimate international regulatory concern rather than purely domestic policy. This was a significant shift in the conceptual framework of international law, because it established for the first time that a pharmaceutical product could be the subject of multilateral treaty obligations, in the same way that more traditional subjects of international regulation, like postal services or shipping standards, had been. The infrastructure that was built up around the Hague Convention, and that was expanded through subsequent conferences in Geneva in 1925 and 1931, formed the basis of the international drug control system that persists, in modified form, to this day. The heroin question, in other words, was instrumental in creating the very idea of international drug control, not merely in being subject to it. The American legislative push continued through the following decade, with a series of additional measures that gradually tightened the framework established by the Harrison Act. A particularly significant development came in 1924, with the passage of the Heroin Act, which imposed a complete ban on the manufacture and importation of heroin in the United States, eliminating the drug even from legitimate medical use. This was a more aggressive step than most other countries took during the same period, and it reflected the particular trajectory of American drug policy, which had been moving steadily toward outright prohibition of certain substances rather than the more flexible regulatory approach adopted in Britain and elsewhere. The elimination of heroin from the American medical market was a somewhat strange moment, because by 1924 the drug had already largely fallen out of legitimate medical use in the United States in favor of other opioid options, which meant that the practical effect of the ban on legitimate medicine was relatively modest. But the symbolic effect was substantial. The Heroin Act communicated, in a way that the more technical Harrison Act had not, that heroin was not merely a tightly regulated substance, but a prohibited one, a drug that had no legitimate place in American society, a drug whose possession or sale through any channel was now categorically illegal. This framing of heroin as a substance that was qualitatively different from other regulated drugs, a substance that was beyond the bounds of acceptable medical or commercial use, would shape American drug policy for the rest of the century. The political rhetoric that accompanied these legislative developments is worth examining closely because it illustrates the speed and completeness with which the cultural position of the drug had shifted. Politicians who had, only a few years earlier, been comfortable being photographed with Bayer products during visits to local pharmacies, or who had endorsed the therapeutic value of modern pharmaceutical innovations in speeches to civic groups, now spoke about narcotics in terms that were dramatically different. The public speeches from this period are remarkable documents, full of urgent calls to action, ominous warnings about threats to American youth, stirring invocations of parental responsibility, and grave references to the national character. The specific substance had changed from hero to villain in the public mind, and the political class, never notably slow to read the shifting winds, had adjusted its rhetoric accordingly. The sincere parents and grandparents who had been quietly administering cough drops to their children a decade earlier were now being told by politicians and newspaper editorialists that those same cough drops represented a mortal threat to everything they held dear. The transition was awkward for anyone with a good memory, but most people obligingly did not have one. The particular invocation of children was a characteristic feature of the political rhetoric during this period, and it set a template that would be followed in many subsequent waves of drug-related legislation. Political speakers emphasized, with considerable emotional force, the need to protect children from the predatory reach of narcotics. The rhetoric was delivered with the sort of solemn urgency that audiences of the era found compelling. The fact that children had been among the most heavily dosed demographic groups during the period of legitimate heroin marketing was a detail that somehow did not come up in these speeches, or if it did, was presented as a regrettable consequence of the previous era's irresponsibility, rather than as a feature of the exact regulatory system that the new legislation was replacing. The children who needed to be protected were, in the rhetoric of 1918 or 1923, future children, hypothetical children, the children of tomorrow, not the actual children who had been receiving actual doses of actual heroin in actual households throughout the preceding 15 years. The framing was emotionally effective, and it drew on genuine parental concern, but it was also, in a certain sense, historically selective, rewriting the immediate past in a way that located the danger outside of respectable households rather than inside them. The transition from legal to illegal status produced a number of immediate consequences that the legislators had not always fully anticipated. The first and most obvious consequence was the creation of an illegal market to serve the existing population of dependent users, who had not stopped being dependent simply because their drug had been reclassified. In the United States, where the Harrison Act had effectively cut off the legitimate medical supply to dependent patients, a black market began to develop almost immediately. The initial supply was drawn from existing stocks of legally manufactured heroin, diverted through various channels that were, at first, relatively amateur in their organization. Pharmacists with access to legitimate stock occasionally sold surplus to dependent customers through the back door, at prices that were substantially higher than the former retail price, and that reflected the new risks involved in such transactions. Manufacturers in countries that had not yet implemented full prohibitions continued to produce heroin and export it through channels that were increasingly difficult to distinguish from outright smuggling. By the early 1920s, a more organized illegal distribution network had begun to take shape, with particular geographic nodes emerging in specific port cities and major urban areas where the combination of demand, supply, and appropriate cover made illegal distribution feasible. The second consequence was a dramatic shift in who was using the drug and how they were using it. Under the previous regime, heroin users had been, on average, a fairly cross-sectional population, including respectable middle-class patients, working-class patients, professionals, homemakers, and a wide variety of other social types. The drug had been acquired through medical channels and consumed in domestic settings, often in carefully measured doses, with minimal exposure to the social networks associated with illegal substances. Under the new regime, the user population changed significantly. Many of the more respectable former users, particularly those who had been consuming smaller amounts for ordinary medical purposes, simply stopped using the drug, either because the inconvenience of obtaining it illegally was more than they were willing to accept, or because their dependence had been relatively modest and was amenable to being overcome with appropriate medical support. The user population that remained consisted disproportionately of those with more serious dependencies who could not easily discontinue use, and of those whose social situations made them more willing or able to engage with the emerging illegal market. The profile of the typical heroin user therefore shifted over a few years from the respectable Aunt Margaret archetype towards something considerably more associated in the public imagination and in statistical fact with urban environments, with particular ethnic and class communities, and with behaviours that were considered socially deviant. This shift then fed back into the cultural stigma attached to the drug, reinforcing the perception that heroin was a substance used by a particular kind of person, which in turn justified increasingly aggressive enforcement responses, which in turn further marginalised the remaining user population, which in turn reinforced the cultural stigma. The feedback loop, once it got going, proved remarkably durable. The third consequence was the beginning of a transformation in the drug itself as a physical product. Legally manufactured heroin had been, whatever its other problems, a product of reasonable pharmaceutical quality. The dose was consistent from bottle to bottle, the purity was predictable, the formulation was stable. The illegal heroin that began to circulate after Prohibition was a different matter. Suppliers operating outside the regulated pharmaceutical system had no particular incentive to maintain consistent quality and considerable incentive to adulterate their product in order to stretch their supply. Early illegal heroin was commonly cut with various inert or semi-active substances, including sugar, starch, quinine, and occasionally more concerning additives, which reduced the effective dose per unit weight and introduced variability that made overdoses more likely. The user who purchased illegal heroin in 1925 had no reliable way to know what proportion of the powder she held actually consisted of the active drug, which meant that the same visible dose could produce very different effects on different occasions. This variability introduced a new category of danger that had been essentially absent during the legal pharmaceutical era. The overdose, which had been a relatively rare event during the period of regulated medical use, became a significantly more common occurrence in the illegal market. The drug had not become more potent. The users had not become more reckless. What had changed was the reliability of the supply chain, and the consequences of that change played out in the form of a steady accumulation of preventable tragedies over the following decades. The fourth consequence was the emergence of a new professional class, on both sides of the law, that specialized in the illegal narcotics trade. On the law enforcement side, federal agencies in the United States and equivalent bodies in other countries began to develop specialized narcotics enforcement divisions, staffed by officers who spent their careers investigating drug-related offenses. These agencies accumulated institutional expertise, political influence, and budgetary resources over the following decades, becoming a significant feature of the administrative state in most industrialized countries. On the other side of the law, a corresponding class of professional criminal distributors emerged, organizing themselves into networks that range from small local operations to international syndicates with sophisticated logistics, financial arrangements, and security practices. Both sides of this emerging contest developed, over time, their own cultures, their own vocabularies, their own sets of tactical practices, and their own implicit rules of engagement. The professional relationship between narcotics police and narcotics distributors would become, over the course of the 20th century, one of the most durable and consequential features of modern urban life, shaping neighborhoods, politics, culture, and public health in ways that would have been difficult to foresee from the perspective of the legislators who had passed the original Prohibition statutes. There was, during these transition years, a particular category of former user whose situation deserves a moment of sympathetic attention. These were the people, often elderly by this point, who had been prescribed heroin legally and in good faith during the previous era, who had developed a dependence through no particular fault of their own, who had continued to obtain the drug through legitimate medical channels for many years, and who now found themselves abruptly cut off by the new legal framework. These people were, in a real sense, casualties of a policy transition rather than participants in any kind of wrongdoing. Their dependence had been, as far as they were concerned, a medical condition acquired through compliance with their doctor's recommendations. The new regime, by eliminating the legal supply, had converted them into criminals or forced them through a difficult and poorly supported withdrawal, depending on what resources and inclinations they happened to have. Some of these former patients, particularly those who were elderly and whose remaining life expectancy was limited, were discreetly managed by sympathetic physicians who found ways to continue providing care within the tightening legal framework. Others were forced into more difficult transitions, and the outcomes for this group were variable. The political discourse of the period tended to treat these former patients either as invisible or as implicitly deserving of their fate, neither framing being particularly accurate or useful. The legislative wave that swept across the industrialized world between 1914 and 1924 accomplished, in relatively short order, the definitive transformation of heroin's legal status. The drug that had been a respectable household product at the start of the century was, by the middle of the 1920s, a controlled substance in most major jurisdictions and a prohibited substance in the United States. The cultural, political, and economic infrastructure that had supported the drug's commercial distribution during its legal era had been dismantled. A new infrastructure, considerably less visible, but in some ways more durable, had emerged to take its place. The question of what exactly to do about the underlying problem of opioid dependence, which had been the nominal reason for the entire legislative transformation, remained largely unanswered. The drug was now illegal, which was, in the framework of the period, considered to be equivalent to the drug being addressed. Whether this framework was actually correct was a question that subsequent decades would have ample opportunity to examine. The answer, when it emerged, would prove to be considerably more complicated than anyone in 1924 was prepared to acknowledge. Prohibition, as many subsequent historical episodes would also demonstrate, is one of the more reliable ways of not actually eliminating something. What it does instead, with almost comedic predictability, is move the something from places where it can be observed and measured into places where it cannot, while simultaneously making the something considerably more profitable for the people willing to deal with it in its new, less visible form. The heroin market after 1924 followed this general pattern with remarkable fidelity. The drug did not disappear. The demand did not evaporate. The users did not collectively decide that they had been cured by the passage of legislation. What happened instead, over a period of perhaps 10 years, was the gradual construction of a parallel economy that served the same appetite the legitimate pharmacy had once served, using different channels, different personnel, different language, and different business models. The interwar period, roughly 1924 through 1939, was the formative era of this parallel economy, and the structures that emerged during these years would define the underground drug trade for the remainder of the 20th century. The most visible early feature of this transition was the corner establishment that did a little bit of its business through the front door and a little bit through the back. In the American context, the prototypical example was the neighborhood drugstore, particularly in working-class urban neighborhoods, where the proprietor knew his regular customers by name and had, during the previous era, dispensed cough syrup and nerve tonic to several of them on a regular basis. After the Harrison Act and the subsequent Heroin Act, these proprietors found themselves in an interesting position. Their former regulars, still dependent on the substance they had legally purchased for years, were now unable to obtain it through any legitimate channel. Some proprietors, understandably wary of federal investigators, declined the awkward inquiries and sent their former customers away. Others, for reasons ranging from genuine compassion to straightforward commercial opportunism, worked out arrangements. A bottle of something unlabeled kept on a high shelf, obtained through a chain of slightly dubious wholesalers, could be produced for the regular who asked for something for her nerves and who understood that the price was now several times what it had been, and that no questions would be asked or answered about the contents. These arrangements were discreet, they were informal, and they were, for the proprietors involved, a meaningful supplementary income that compensated for the general decline in legitimate narcotic sales. They were also, to put it gently, not in compliance with the new federal framework, which meant that the ones who got caught faced serious consequences, and the ones who did not get caught kept doing it. The transition from backdoor pharmacy to organized illegal distribution happened unevenly across different cities, but the general pattern involved a few predictable steps. The small-time supplier, working through a handful of trusted regulars, was gradually supplemented and then replaced by more professional operators who could handle larger volumes, offer more reliable supply, and, importantly, manage the risks of prosecution more effectively through a combination of better operational security and, where necessary, appropriate relationships with local officials. By the late 1920s, most major American cities had established networks of distributors who operated independently of the formal pharmacy system, purchasing their product through a combination of diverted pharmaceutical supplies, smuggled imports from countries where heroin manufacture was still legal, and eventually, as those sources tightened, clandestine production in small-scale laboratories operating within the United States itself. The product that moved through these networks varied enormously in quality, purity, and reliability, and the consumer purchasing it had no ability to verify what she was actually buying. This uncertainty, combined with the significantly higher prices that illegal distribution commanded, transformed the economic experience of being a heroin user. What had once been a modest regular expenditure comparable to the cost of household staples was now a considerable and steadily rising expense that could easily consume a significant portion of a person's income. Cultural life during the interwar period provided a number of settings where the emerging underground economy intersected with broader social life in ways that were, at the time, genuinely novel. The jazz scenes of the 1920s and 1930s, which developed in particular concentrations in New Orleans, Chicago, Kansas City, New York, and a handful of other American cities, became one of these intersection points, not because musicians were uniformly heavy users, as the tabloid coverage sometimes implied, but because the late-night club environment where jazz was performed happened to provide cover for a variety of activities that required discretion. The clubs operated on schedules that were incompatible with ordinary daytime oversight. They served populations that were mixed in ways that made surveillance awkward. They had their own internal economies of tips, favours, and informal exchanges that could accommodate transactions outside the formal economy. And they had, in many cases, owners and operators who had connections to the broader underground economy that had emerged during Prohibition to serve the demand for alcohol. The infrastructure built for moving liquor could, with minor adjustments, also move other controlled substances, and some of the same people who had made their reputations during the alcohol years found it natural to continue in related lines of work after 1933, when alcohol prohibition ended and other regulated substances remained, well, regulated. The musicians themselves, who have probably received a disproportionate share of the cultural attention during this era, were a more complicated population than the tabloid version suggested. Some were regular users, some were occasional users, most were not users at all, and the ones who were users arrived at their use through the same general set of pathways that users in other occupations arrived at theirs, which included medical prescription histories, chronic pain, social circles where use was normalized, and the familiar pressures of a demanding profession with unusual hours. What was distinctive about the jazz scene was not that musicians had any special propensity for use, but that their professional environment put them in repeated contact with the underground economy, and the tight creative communities that developed around particular clubs and particular cities meant that habits of use, when they developed, could spread within those communities along familiar social lines. The cultural association between jazz and heroin that later entered the popular imagination was, in this sense, partly a matter of genuine historical fact, partly a matter of tabloid simplification, and partly a matter of the particular ways that mainstream American culture, in the middle of the 20th century, tended to link racial minority communities with drug problems, regardless of the underlying statistical reality. The international dimension of the interwar heroin market deserves its own consideration, because the drug was becoming, even as its legal status tightened in one country after another, a genuinely global commodity in ways it had not been during the regulated pharmaceutical era. When Bayer had distributed heroin during its early commercial period, the distribution chains had run through legitimate pharmaceutical wholesalers and retail pharmacies, with the product moving through customs and regulatory inspections like any other medicine. After Prohibition, the distribution chains reorganized themselves around different geographic nodes. Cities with large ports, with significant criminal infrastructure, and with convenient access to regions where heroin could still be manufactured legally or semi-legally became, by the late 1920s, the major nodes of the international illegal market. Marseille, with its combination of Mediterranean port access, substantial chemical industry infrastructure, and organized criminal networks that had developed during the 19th century, became one particularly significant node, processing morphine base imported from further east into finished heroin that could be distributed to European and American markets. Shanghai, which had been a major center for opium commerce for nearly a century, continued its role as a hub of the opioid economy through the interwar period, with large quantities of product moving through its docks in various directions. Istanbul, Beirut, Tangier, and several other cities that sat at crossroads of the older opium trade acquired or expanded corresponding roles in the emerging heroin economy, each developing its own particular specialties in production, refinement, or distribution. The movement from legitimate pharmaceutical commerce to illegal international trade was not a clean transition. It happened in stages, with some manufacturing and distribution remaining technically legal in certain jurisdictions for years after it had become illegal in others, and with the boundaries between legitimate and illicit activity sometimes hard to trace. A German pharmaceutical company, for example, might manufacture heroin for what it claimed were legitimate medical purposes in countries where such use remained legal, while knowing perfectly well that a significant portion of its output was ending up in illegal channels abroad. A Swiss wholesaler might handle shipments that it described as destined for authorized importers in Asia, while the actual distribution on arrival followed paths that had little to do with the official documentation. The League of Nations, during the 1920s and 1930s, devoted considerable attention to tracking these patterns and attempting to close the loopholes that allowed legitimate production to feed illegitimate distribution, with mixed success. By the late 1930s, the manufacturers and distributors who remained in the heroin business were increasingly operating outside any legitimate regulatory framework, the overlap zone having been gradually squeezed out of existence by a combination of tightening international rules and the basic commercial logic of the emerging illegal market. The cultural vocabulary of this underground economy developed its own distinctive features during these years. A rich lexicon of slang terms, coded references, and insider language emerged to allow buyers and sellers to discuss their transactions without saying anything that could be easily used as evidence by a prosecutor. Street names for the drug multiplied and shifted regularly, with particular terms achieving currency in particular cities and particular subcultures before being replaced by newer terms as the older ones became too widely recognized. The culture of the street dealer, the courier, the lookout, the hustler, and the various other roles that organized the illegal distribution economy began to develop its own internal norms, its own expectations about how different transactions should be conducted, its own mechanisms for handling disputes without involving law enforcement, and its own patterns of advancement and betrayal. This was, in a sense, the birth of the urban drug subculture that would become a durable feature of 20th century social life, with distinctive dress, distinctive speech patterns, distinctive values, and a distinctive relationship to the broader society that viewed it with a mixture of fear, fascination, and occasionally reluctant admiration. The tabloid press of the period found this subculture endlessly compelling and covered it with a level of attention that was, in retrospect, somewhat disproportionate to its actual size and significance during this early phase of its development. By the outbreak of the Second World War, the basic infrastructure of the modern heroin economy was essentially in place. There was a supply chain that ran from opium-producing regions through refinement points to distribution hubs, and from there to end users in major urban markets. There was a specialized workforce on both sides of the law that managed the ongoing contest between distribution and enforcement. There was a cultural vocabulary that accommodated the drug as a recognized, if unwelcome, feature of modern urban life. There was a legal and regulatory framework that defined the drug as categorically illegal and that provided the basis for an enforcement apparatus that would grow substantially over the following decades. And there was, underlying all of this, a continuing demand from a user population that the prohibition framework had done almost nothing to reduce. The war itself disrupted many of the existing distribution networks, as shipping routes were interrupted and resources were diverted to other priorities, and during the war years the heroin market in many parts of the world contracted significantly. This contraction was, however, a temporary phenomenon. What came next, after the war, was an expansion that would dwarf anything seen during the interwar period, and that would complete the drug's transformation from a largely American and European phenomenon into a genuinely global one. The post-war era brought changes in nearly every dimension of the heroin economy. New supply sources opened up in regions that had not previously been significant players, as the political and economic reorganization of the post-war world created opportunities for enterprising actors to establish new production and trafficking networks. Southeast Asia, particularly the region that became known as the Golden Triangle, where Burma, Thailand and Laos meet, emerged over the late 1940s and 1950s as a major source of opium that was then refined into heroin for distribution to markets in Europe and the Americas. The particular political circumstances of the Cold War, in which various Western intelligence agencies developed complicated relationships with regional actors who happened to be involved in the opium trade, contributed to the growth of production in this region, though the full details of these relationships would not become widely known until much later. A parallel development in the late 1960s and 1970s saw the emergence of Afghanistan and the surrounding region as a major source of supply, a role that region would continue to play for the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st. On the demand side, the user population expanded geographically and demographically in ways that reshaped the public perception of the drug. In the immediate post-war decades, heroin use in American cities concentrated particularly in certain urban neighborhoods, including areas of New York City like parts of Harlem and the South Bronx, and equivalent neighborhoods in other major cities. These communities, which had long been disadvantaged by a combination of economic and social factors, became the focal points of a new wave of use that spread through social networks at a pace that alarmed public health authorities. The reasons for the concentration of use in particular neighborhoods were debated extensively at the time and remain debated today, with explanations ranging from economic deprivation to deliberate law enforcement neglect to the availability of supply to the broader sociological phenomenon of concentrated poverty producing concentrated harm. Whatever the combination of causes, the effect on the cultural perception of heroin was significant. The drug, which in its early pharmaceutical era had been associated with respectable middle-class households, and which in its interwar underground era had been associated with bohemian urban subcultures, was now being associated, in the mainstream American imagination, with specific inner-city neighborhoods and specific demographic groups. This shift in perception carried with it all of the baggage that such shifts typically carry in mid-20th century America, including a substantial component of racial stereotyping that would color drug policy and public discourse for decades. The tabloid press of the post-war era found in heroin an inexhaustible source of sensational copy. Celebrity cases provided regular headlines, with the arrests, breakdowns, and occasional deaths of famous users generating extended coverage that was often considerably more extensive than the coverage devoted to any particular case warranted. The phrase heroin chic briefly entered the fashion vocabulary, first during the post-war period and then again in waves over subsequent decades, describing an aesthetic of thin, pale, hollow-eyed models that periodically became fashionable despite the obvious implications of what exactly was being idealized. Films, novels, and later television programs drew on heroin-related themes with varying degrees of accuracy and sensationalism, establishing and reinforcing a cultural iconography that most consumers of popular entertainment absorbed whether or not they had any direct experience with the underlying reality. The cumulative effect of this cultural production was to fix heroin in the popular imagination as a specific kind of story, with specific kinds of characters, specific kinds of settings, and specific kinds of outcomes. The actual experience of the actual users, which was in most cases considerably more mundane and considerably less dramatic than the cultural representation suggested, was largely drowned out by the louder and more marketable versions. The political response to the post-war expansion of heroin use culminated in the formal declaration by the administration of President Richard Nixon in the early 1970s of what came to be called the War on Drugs. This framework, which built on but significantly extended the earlier enforcement infrastructure, committed substantial federal resources to interdiction, to domestic law enforcement, and to the prosecution and incarceration of people involved in the drug trade at various levels. Specialized enforcement units were created or expanded, including the Drug Enforcement Administration, which consolidated several previously separate federal agencies into a single organization focused specifically on narcotics enforcement. Sentencing laws were toughened, with mandatory minimum sentences imposed for various drug-related offenses. The language of war, with its associated vocabulary of battles, fronts, and victories, was applied to the enforcement effort in ways that shaped both the public understanding of the issue and the institutional culture of the agencies involved. The rhetoric was, at the time, widely popular, and both major American political parties generally supported the direction of policy through the 1970s, 1980s, and into the 1990s. Subsequent administrations expanded on the framework in their own ways. The Reagan era in the 1980s added the Just Say No campaign, associated particularly with First Lady Nancy Reagan, which attempted to reduce demand through a public education effort aimed primarily at young people. The campaign, which achieved considerable cultural visibility through its use of television advertising, school programs, and celebrity endorsements, became one of the most recognizable public health communication efforts of the era, though its actual impact on drug use behaviors was subsequently assessed by researchers as modest at best. The same period saw a significant expansion of incarceration for drug offenses, with prison populations in the United States growing to levels that were, by the 1990s, the highest per capita of any country in the world, driven in substantial part by drug-related prosecutions. Critics of the War on Drugs framework pointed out, with increasing volume as the decades passed, that the enforcement effort did not appear to be producing the outcomes its advocates had promised. The drugs remained available. The user population did not shrink proportionally to the enforcement intensity. The prices of illegal drugs, which in a successful enforcement scenario should have risen significantly as supply was disrupted, actually declined over much of this period, suggesting that supply was, if anything, expanding rather than contracting. The costs of the enforcement effort, both financial and social, accumulated steadily. The disparity between the intended and actual effects of the enforcement framework produced, by the late decades of the 20th century, a growing sense in many expert communities that the approach was not working as advertised. This sense was not, initially, widely shared in the political mainstream, and the general framework of prohibition and aggressive enforcement remained the dominant policy throughout the 1980s and 1990s. But a growing body of academic research, a growing chorus of public health voices, and a growing set of international comparisons were beginning to accumulate evidence that the particular approach the United States and several of its close allies had adopted was producing results that were, at best, mixed, and at worst, significantly counterproductive. The costs of mass incarceration were becoming visible in ways that were difficult to ignore. The collateral consequences of drug convictions on affected communities, including employment difficulties, family disruption, and loss of civic rights, were accumulating into a substantial body of social damage. The public health consequences of driving drug use underground, including the spread of infectious diseases through shared injection equipment, and the ongoing problem of overdose deaths from unreliable illegal supply, were increasingly understood as problems that enforcement had not solved and had in some ways worsened. There is something genuinely striking about the arc of the 20th century as it relates to this one drug. The substance had begun the century as a respectable household remedy, marketed with great confidence as a miracle of modern pharmaceutical science. It had ended the century as the subject of one of the most extensive and expensive law enforcement efforts in modern history, with prisons full of people whose primary offence was involvement with its distribution or use, and with an annual death toll from overdoses that had grown by the final years of the century to levels that would have been inconceivable to the pharmacists who had once stocked its cheerful amber bottles on their shelves. The drug had not changed. The molecule remained exactly what Charles Alder Wright had briefly synthesized in his Paddington laboratory a century and a quarter earlier, exactly what Felix Hoffmann's team had rediscovered in Elberfeld, exactly what Bayer had marketed as heroin, exactly what the Harrison Act had sought to contain. What had changed over a century of policy experimentation was the social and legal infrastructure around the drug, the cultural vocabulary used to discuss it, the populations most associated with its use, and the nature of the contest between those who wanted to supply it and those who wanted to prevent the supply. The drug itself, with what one might call remarkable chemical consistency, had simply gone on being the thing it had always been, indifferent to the human institutions that had alternately celebrated and persecuted it, and continuing to produce the same effects on the same receptors in the same human brains across all of the wildly different cultural and legal environments in which it was encountered. There is a lesson in this, about the limits of what policy can accomplish against the underlying chemistry of addiction, and about the costs of pursuing policy frameworks that fundamentally misunderstand what they are trying to address. the lesson was being absorbed, slowly and unevenly, by the end of the 20th century. What to do about it remained, as the new century began, an open question with few easy answers and a rapidly shifting set of new challenges that would make the old challenges look, by comparison, almost manageable. Walk into the global headquarters of Bayer today, in the German city of Leverkusen, and you will find yourself in a gleaming modern corporate campus that communicates, in every architectural detail and every carefully curated piece of lobby signage, a particular version of the company's history. The version emphasizes aspirin, which still appears in millions of medicine cabinets worldwide. It emphasizes the company's contemporary portfolio, which spans pharmaceuticals, agricultural chemistry, and consumer health products across more than 80 countries. It emphasizes scientific achievement, social responsibility, and the steady unfolding of a 160-year corporate journey that began in a small dye works in Barmen and has grown into one of the largest chemical and pharmaceutical enterprises in the world. What the version does not emphasize, you will probably not be surprised to hear, is heroin. The word does not appear on the heritage timeline mounted in the visitor center. It does not feature in the corporate histories distributed to new employees. It is not referenced in the annual reports. It is not part of the story the company tells about itself, and it has not been part of that story for the better part of a century. The erasure has been, by any reasonable standard, remarkably thorough. This is not precisely a conspiracy. Corporate histories are, by their nature, narratives, and narratives involve choices about what to include and what to leave out. A company of Bayer's size and longevity has accumulated, over the course of its existence, a substantial archive of products, campaigns, decisions, and episodes, and no practical corporate history could possibly include all of them. The decision to downplay heroin in the official story is, in one sense, simply the kind of editorial judgment that any institution makes about its past. But the thoroughness with which this particular episode has been handled does stand out. The company's first flagship pharmaceutical product, launched with international fanfare and sold for nearly 2 decades under the Bayer name, is, in the corporate literature produced by Bayer's own communications departments, nearly invisible. A visitor to the Leverkusen headquarters who did not already know about the heroin years could plausibly leave the facility without ever encountering any reference to them. The version of Bayer that the company presents to the public is a company that invented aspirin, built up a distinguished pharmaceutical research tradition, weathered various 20th century upheavals including the complicated E.G. Farben period during the 1930s and 1940s, and emerged in the post-war era as a respected pillar of global industry. It is not a company that sold diacetyl morphine as a cough syrup for children. That company, according to the official record, never quite existed. What does exist, for those who care to look, is a reasonably robust historical literature outside the company itself that documents the heroin years in considerable detail. Historians of medicine, historians of marketing, historians of pharmaceutical policy, and scholars of drug history have collectively produced over the past several decades a substantial body of work that reconstructs the original launch, the marketing campaigns, the scientific reckoning, and the regulatory response we have been tracing throughout this story. Much of this scholarship draws on archival materials that have survived despite the company's general tendency to move on from the episode, including copies of original advertising placed in medical journals, trade correspondence preserved in the archives of other pharmaceutical firms, clinical records from hospitals that prescribed the drug during its legal era, and the regulatory files generated by various national governments as they developed their drug control frameworks. The scholarship has also drawn on a growing willingness by Bayer itself, particularly in more recent decades, to acknowledge at least in general terms that the company did manufacture heroin during the early 20th century. The acknowledgement tends to be brief, factual, and presented in the context of a broader narrative about the evolution of pharmaceutical science and regulation. It does not usually include an apology, because it is not entirely clear what the contemporary Bayer would be apologizing for. Given that the original decisions were made more than a century ago by people who are no longer living and in a regulatory environment that no longer exists. But the acknowledgement is at least present, if you know where to find it, and it represents a slow and partial reopening of the corporate memory on this particular subject. There is a particular atmosphere that settles over pharmaceutical industry gatherings when the subject of the heroin years comes up, and it is worth describing because it captures something about how the contemporary industry has come to process this part of its inheritance. These conversations do not usually happen in formal settings. They happen in the margins of industry conferences, in hotel bars after the day's scheduled sessions have concluded, among small groups of scientists or executives who are unwinding after long days of presentations and meetings. Someone will mention, usually in the context of a broader discussion about marketing ethics or regulatory history, that Bayer once sold heroin as a cough remedy. The assertion is met by the other participants with a mixture of rueful acknowledgement and dry humour. Jokes are made, usually at the expense of the original marketers or the scientific establishment of the period that accepted the product so readily. Comparisons are drawn, sometimes seriously and sometimes not, to more recent pharmaceutical episodes in which products have been marketed with greater enthusiasm than later evidence justified. The conversation eventually moves on to other topics. What the conversation does not usually include is any serious contemporary defense of the original product. Nobody in the current pharmaceutical industry, when the subject comes up in these informal settings, argues that heroin was actually fine and the subsequent regulatory response was excessive. The consensus, insofar as there is one, is that the original product represented a characteristic failure of its era, the kind of thing that a scientifically optimistic industry could have been expected to produce in a regulatory vacuum, and a lesson of sorts for subsequent generations about the limits of pre-market testing and the dangers of marketing language that runs ahead of actual evidence. Whether the lesson has been fully absorbed is, of course, a different question. The broader medical and public health world during the decades since the legal prohibition era has undergone its own extended reckoning with the question of how to address the ongoing reality of opioid dependence. The enforcement framework we traced in the previous chapter was, throughout much of the 20th century, the dominant approach. The underlying assumption, more or less explicit depending on the period and the country, was that drug dependence was primarily a criminal justice problem, addressable through interdiction, prosecution, and incarceration, with treatment playing a secondary and largely rehabilitative role for those who'd been identified through the criminal justice system. This framework produced, as we have already noted, results that were at best mixed. The expansion of enforcement did not correspond to a reduction in dependence. The prison system became, over several decades, a significant informal warehouse for people whose primary problem was a medical condition that the warehouse was not equipped to address. The communities most affected by both drug use and drug enforcement found themselves caught in feedback loops that damaged both their individual members and their collective institutions. By the final decades of the 20th century, a growing number of public health practitioners, researchers, and advocates had concluded that the enforcement-first framework was not working as advertised, and they had begun to develop and promote a set of alternative approaches that came to be known, collectively, as harm reduction. The harm reduction framework starts from a different premise than the enforcement framework, where enforcement begins with the assumption that the goal is to eliminate drug use through the application of sufficient pressure. Harm reduction begins with the recognition that drug use, for better or worse, is a persistent feature of human societies, and that the practical goal of public policy should be to reduce the specific harms associated with that use, rather than to eliminate the use itself. This reframing has significant practical implications. Under an enforcement-first framework, for example, the provision of clean injection equipment to active drug users might be viewed as a form of assistance to criminal activity, encouraging continued use by making it safer. Under a harm reduction framework, the provision of clean equipment is viewed as a public health intervention that reduces the transmission of bloodborne infections, which is a concrete and measurable benefit regardless of whether the underlying drug use continues. The two frameworks, as you can see, reach very different conclusions about what should be done, starting from different assumptions about what the goal actually is. Concrete harm reduction interventions that developed through the late 20th century and into the 21st include several distinct categories, each addressing a specific subset of the harms associated with opioid use. Needle and syringe exchange programs, pioneered in the Netherlands and the United Kingdom in response to concerns about HIV transmission among injection drug users in the 1980s, expanded over subsequent decades to become standard public health interventions in many countries. These programs, which provide clean injection equipment to active users in exchange for used equipment, have been extensively studied and consistently found to reduce transmission of HIV, hepatitis, and other bloodborne infections without producing measurable increases in drug use. The opposition to these programs in some jurisdictions, particularly in parts of the United States, persisted for decades despite the accumulating evidence. But the general direction of policy in most developed countries has been toward broader adoption of needle exchange as a recognized public health tool. The development of naloxone as a widely available overdose reversal medication represents another major harm reduction intervention. Naloxone, which is a compound that can quickly reverse the effects of an opioid overdose by displacing the drug from the receptors in the brain where it produces respiratory depression, has been a standard emergency medical tool since the 1970s, but its availability was historically limited to hospital and ambulance settings. Beginning in the late 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s and 2010s, public health advocates pushed for much wider distribution of the medication, including making it available to the family members and associates of active users, training first responders and community members in its use, and in many jurisdictions, making it available through pharmacies without a prescription or through dedicated distribution programs. The expanded availability of naloxone has, by any reasonable assessment, saved a significant number of lives that would otherwise have been lost to accidental overdose, though the exact numbers are difficult to calculate precisely because they involve counting events that did not happen. A person who receives a dose of naloxone during a respiratory emergency and subsequently walks away to continue their life does not usually end up in the official statistics as an intervention outcome, even though they represent exactly the outcome the intervention was designed to produce. Medication-assisted treatment represents a third major harm reduction intervention, and one that has produced considerable debate within both medical and political communities. The basic premise is that dependent patients can often achieve better outcomes through the long-term provision of carefully managed doses of related medications, such as methadone or buprenorphine, than through attempts at complete abstinence. These medications, which work on the same receptor systems as heroin but with different pharmacological profiles, can stabilize a patient's day-to-day functioning, reduce the intensity of cravings, prevent the acute withdrawal syndrome, and allow the patient to resume ordinary social and economic life while remaining under medical supervision. The outcomes for patients in well-managed medication-assisted treatment programs are, on average, significantly better than the outcomes for patients attempting abstinence-based approaches, though individual results vary. The approach has been standard in several European countries for decades and has expanded considerably in the United States over recent years, though access remains uneven across different jurisdictions and different populations. Supervised consumption facilities, sometimes called safe consumption sites, represent a more recent and more controversial harm reduction intervention. These facilities, which first emerged in Switzerland and the Netherlands in the 1980s and 1990s, and have since expanded to a number of other countries, provide a supervised environment where active users can consume their drugs under the observation of medical staff who can respond immediately in the event of an overdose or other medical emergency. The rationale is straightforward. Most overdose deaths occur in unsupervised settings where no one is present to call for help or provide emergency response. A facility that provides immediate response capability eliminates most of these deaths, while also providing users with access to broader harm reduction services, including testing, treatment referrals, and basic medical care. The facilities have been extensively studied in the jurisdictions where they operate, and the research consistently finds that they reduce overdose deaths, reduce public drug use in surrounding neighborhoods, and increase connections between active users and treatment systems. The facilities remain politically contentious in many places, and the specific combination of legal, logistical, and political factors that determines whether such facilities can be established varies significantly across different jurisdictions. The language used to discuss drug dependence has also undergone a significant evolution over recent decades, partly as a result of the harm reduction movement and partly as a reflection of broader changes in how medical and social problems are discussed in general. The word addict, which as we noted earlier had acquired a distinctly moralistic freight over the course of the 20th century, has increasingly been replaced in clinical and advocacy contexts with phrases like person who uses drugs or person with a substance use disorder. The change, which might seem purely cosmetic to casual observers, reflects a substantive shift in how the underlying phenomenon is conceptualized. The older language placed the drug dependents at the center of the person's identity, defining them by their relationship with a substance. The newer language treats the dependence as a condition the person has, rather than something the person is, preserving a separation between the person and the disorder that allows for a more clinical and less judgmental approach. The shift is not universally embraced, and some advocates and people in recovery prefer the older terminology, which they find more direct and less euphemistic. But the general direction of evolution has been toward language that is less stigmatizing, more clinically precise, and more consistent with how other medical conditions are discussed. Depression is not called sadness, and a person with depression is not usually called a sadness sufferer. The gradual extension of similar clinical vocabulary to substance use represents, in a modest way, a normalization of the condition as a medical matter rather than a moral one. The cumulative effect of these various developments, by the time we reach the present year of 2026, is a policy landscape that is meaningfully different from the one that existed 20 or 30 years ago. Many countries have expanded harm reduction services significantly. Many have reduced criminal penalties for personal drug use, while retaining or strengthening penalties for trafficking. Several have experimented with more radical reforms, including the decriminalization of personal possession of small amounts of drugs across the board, with varying results that are still being studied. Public understanding of drug dependence as primarily a medical rather than a moral matter has increased, though it remains far from universal, and the political salience of drug policy as a campaign issue has declined in many jurisdictions compared to the peak years of the war on drugs rhetoric. The conversation is, on the whole, more informed and less inflammatory than it was at the height of the enforcement era, though this improvement should not be overstated, because significant pockets of the older framework remain influential in particular places and particular political moments. What has emphatically not happened, however, is the resolution of the underlying problem. The 21st century has brought not the end of the opioid crisis, but its intensification, through the emergence of new substances and new distribution patterns that have in many ways surpassed anything the heroin era produced at its peak. The most significant development has been the rise of synthetic opioids, particularly fentanyl and its various chemical relatives, which have largely displaced heroin in many illegal markets over the past decade. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid originally developed in the late 1950s for legitimate medical use, particularly as an analgesic for severe pain and as an anesthetic in surgical settings. In its legitimate medical applications, administered in precisely calibrated doses by trained practitioners, fentanyl is a valuable and widely used medication that has been incorporated into modern medical practice for decades. The problem is that fentanyl is also extraordinarily potent, roughly 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine on a per-weight basis, which means that very small variations in dose produce very large variations in effect. When fentanyl is produced in clandestine laboratories, distributed through informal channels, and consumed by users who have no reliable way to know what dose they are actually receiving, the potential for accidental overdose is dramatically higher than with less potent substances. The transition from heroin to fentanyl in many illegal markets, which accelerated through the 2000s and has continued into the 2020s, has produced a public health crisis of a scale that the heroin era, for all its severity, did not match. Annual overdose deaths in the United States crossed 100,000 per year during the early 2020s and have remained near those levels through the present, the overwhelming majority of those deaths involving fentanyl or related synthetic opioids. Similar trends, though with lower absolute numbers, have been observed across Canada, the United Kingdom, and several other developed countries. The particular distribution patterns of fentanyl, which is potent enough that a single shipment can supply enormous quantities of drug in a small and easily transportable package, have made interdiction significantly more difficult than it was in the heroin era, when the bulkier nature of the product imposed its own logistical constraints on smuggling. The enforcement infrastructure that was built up over the 20th century to address the heroin trade has, in confronting fentanyl, encountered a challenge that its tools and methods are not particularly well suited to address. The harm reduction infrastructure that has been developed in recent decades has also had to adapt to the new circumstances. Naloxone, which remains effective against fentanyl overdoses, often requires multiple doses to reverse an overdose involving the more potent synthetic, compared to the single dose that was typically sufficient for heroin. Supervised consumption facilities, which operate according to protocols developed for less potent substances, have had to adjust their practices to account for the reduced window of time between the onset of an overdose and the point at which permanent damage or death occurs. Drug checking services, which allow users to submit samples of what they intend to consume for laboratory analysis, have become more important as the actual composition of illegal drugs has become less predictable. with fentanyl appearing in products sold as heroin, as counterfeit prescription pills, and as other substances that users may not even be aware contain opioids at all. The public health community is, in a sense, playing a continuous game of catch-up with a distribution system that keeps introducing new variables faster than responses can be developed. There is something worth pausing to consider in the overall arc of this history, because it touches on a recurring pattern that extends well beyond the specific story of one drug. Each era of modern pharmaceutical development has tended to produce, alongside its genuine advances, at least one confident claim about a new compound that turned out to require substantial subsequent revision. The heroin era's claim, which we have traced in detail, was that a modified version of morphine could deliver morphine's benefits without its dependence potential. Later eras produced their own versions of similar claims. The barbiturates that dominated sleep and anxiety treatment in the early 20th century were marketed with assurances about their safety that later evidence qualified significantly. The tranquilizers that replaced the barbiturates in the middle of the 20th century came with their own initial overconfidence that subsequent experience required adjusting. The semi-synthetic opioid analgesics that were heavily marketed in the United States during the late 1990s and early 2000s were accompanied by claims about their reduced addiction potential that have since been assessed by multiple investigations as having been, at minimum, substantially overstated, and these claims played a significant role in the opioid crisis that developed through the 2000s. The pattern is not universal, and many pharmaceutical innovations have delivered on their original claims without major revision. But the pattern does recur, and it recurs with enough regularity that a reasonable observer might conclude that the pharmaceutical industry has a persistent tendency, across generations and across specific product categories, to produce initial marketing claims that run somewhat ahead of the actual evidence, with the shortfall between claim and evidence only becoming visible after significant damage has been done. The contemporary moment, from the perspective of this longer history, is one of both considerable progress and significant ongoing challenge. The progress is real. The scientific understanding of opioid pharmacology is vastly more sophisticated than it was in 1898, or for that matter, than it was in 1968. The policy frameworks in most developed countries incorporate at least some recognition that dependence is a medical condition and that harm reduction interventions can save lives. The language used to discuss the issue has evolved towards something less stigmatizing and more clinically accurate. The institutional response, while far from perfect, includes a wider range of tools and a more evidence-based approach than would have been available in earlier eras. The challenge is also real. The crisis has not ended. The death toll in affected countries remains at levels that would have been considered catastrophic by the standards of 20 years ago, and the emergence of ever more potent synthetic compounds continues to push the boundaries of what existing response systems can effectively address. The populations affected by the contemporary crisis are in many ways different from those affected in earlier eras, with the current crisis reaching into rural communities, small towns and demographic groups that were relatively less affected during the heroin era, while continuing to weigh heavily on communities that have experienced multiple waves of drug-related harm over several decades. What this history finally suggests, if it suggests anything, is a certain humility about the claims that any given era makes about its own medical and pharmacological innovations. The biochemists of 1898 were not uniquely foolish or uniquely reckless. They were competent scientists working within the best understanding of their field, using the most sophisticated techniques available, producing a product that passed the evaluation standards of their time, and marketing it with the confidence that those evaluation standards seemed to justify. They were wrong, as we have seen in detail, but they were not wrong in ways that the people of their era could easily have recognized as they were happening. The wrongness only became visible over years, through the accumulation of clinical experience and the development of more rigorous scientific methods. This is not an argument for cynicism about pharmaceutical innovation, which has genuinely transformed human health in ways that would have seemed magical to the people of earlier centuries. It is an argument for a certain cautious skepticism about new claims, particularly when those claims promise to solve long-standing problems through novel mechanisms. The miracle in the bottle, in whatever form it happens to arrive in any given era, tends to require a few decades of use before its full profile becomes apparent. The people who will eventually be in a position to assess that profile are generally not the people who are making the initial claims. The lesson that every era is confident that its latest development will be different from all the previous ones And the accompanying observation that every era tends to be at least partly wrong about this is perhaps the most durable takeaway from the entire 120-year arc we have been tracing. That is the story of Heroin, from the forgotten English laboratory of 1874 through the German industrial triumph of 1898, through the domestic saturation of the early 20th century, through the scientific reckoning of the 1910s, through the legal transformation of the 1920s, through the underground economies of the interwar and post-war decades, through the enforcement era and the harm reduction era, and into the synthetic opioid crisis of the current moment. It is a story about chemistry, about marketing, about regulation, about public health, about stigma, about commerce, about the limits of what any single generation can know about the products it produces and consumes. It is also, in the end, a story about the durable human tendency to hope that this time the answer has finally been found, and the equally durable reality that answers of this kind tend to reveal themselves more slowly and more ambiguously than anyone would prefer. 130 years after Charles Alder Wright produced his modest crystalline powder and decided it was not worth the bother, the compound he briefly held in his hands is still, in one form or another, at the centre of one of the most consequential ongoing public health conversations in the world. He could not have imagined it. Nobody could have. The story is, in the deepest sense, not finished, and it is probably going to keep surprising its participants for a long time yet. Thank you for spending this time with me on what has turned out to be one of the stranger corners of modern medical history. If you learned something, if you saw something in a new light, or if you simply enjoyed the ride, hit the like button, subscribe for more long-form deep dives into the curious corners of the past, and let me know in the comments which episode you want next. Take care of yourselves out there, and I will see you in the next video.